Tonight, something is wrong. You are tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from running out of hours. Not the kind that disappears when your eyes finally close. You are tired even though you are lying still. Your body has stopped moving, but something inside you hasn't. That kind of tiredness doesn't feel heavy in the muscles. It feels hollow, like energy leaking through a place you can't see. And if it's 1 or 2 in the morning right now, this probably feels uncomfortably familiar. Because at this hour, the lie breaks. We are told a simple story about exhaustion. You're tired because you didn't sleep enough. So you rest. You cancel plans. You lie down earlier. You do everything right. And yet, the tiredness stays. Tonight's question is not how to sleep better. It's more unsettling than that. What if your exhaustion has nothing to do with sleep at all? If you've ever woken up already tired, if you've ever rested all day and felt worse at night, if you've ever wondered why doing nothing can still drain you, then stay with this recording. Before we go any deeper, if you find yourself drawn to these late-night questions that don't rush, don't shout, and don't promise easy answers, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who stays awake too long, and subscribe to Sleepy Scientist Recordings. This channel exists for nights exactly like this one. Now, let's continue. There is a kind of exhaustion that doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't come after effort. It doesn't arrive with pain. It arrives quietly, often after the day is already over. You feel it when the lights go off, when distractions fade, when there is nothing left to respond to, and suddenly your body feels heavier than it should, even though it hasn't done much at all. That's because the body isn't always what's tired. Sometimes the problem is that your brain never stopped working. During the day, your mind performs. It solves, it reacts, it filters, it suppresses, it keeps certain thoughts on hold. Questions like, am I going in the right direction? Why does this still bother me? What happens if nothing changes? Those thoughts don't disappear. They wait, and when the world finally goes quiet, the brain no longer has a reason to hold them back. So it resumes its unfinished work. Not loudly, not urgently, just persistently. This is why lying down can feel more exhausting than standing up. Because the brain doesn't experience rest the same way the body does. The body rests when movement stops. The brain rests only when resolution happens. And resolution is rare. Most days end without closure. Conversations trail off. Decisions remain open. Expectations stay unmet. Your brain keeps track of all of that. At night, it tries to organize the mess. Not to torture you, not to sabotage your sleep, but because unresolved information is expensive to store. Neuroscience calls this cognitive load, but that term feels too clean for what it actually is. It's the weight of things that never finished becoming something, thoughts that didn't turn into actions, feelings that didn't turn into words, plans that didn't turn into reality. Each one is small. Together, they form a background drain. This is why you can sleep for 8 hours and wake up feeling like you never left the day behind, because rest without mental closure is only partial rest, and your system knows the difference. But there is another kind of tiredness that's even harder to explain. It doesn't come from thinking too much. It comes from having nothing to think forward to. You may recognize this one as well. It's the exhaustion that appears when tomorrow looks exactly like today, when there's no clear reason to be excited, no obvious milestone waiting, not sadness, not despair, just flatness. Biologically, the brain is designed to anticipate. It allocates energy based on what it expects to need. When there is something ahead, a goal, a change, even a challenge, the brain prepares resources. But when the future feels blank, the brain enters a strange conservation mode, not rest, more like withdrawal. Motivation drops, focus weakens, fatigue sets in without effort. You feel tired not because you did too much, but because your system sees no reason to stay alert. This kind of tiredness doesn't respond to naps. It doesn't disappear with weekends. It lingers because it's not asking for sleep. It's asking for meaning, and meaning is not something you can force. That's why telling yourself to just rest doesn't work. Your body already is. It's your internal narrative that's exhausted. The part of you that tries to answer a very quiet question. Why am I doing all of this? At night, when there's no performance left, that question becomes louder, not aggressive, just present. And presence at 2 a.m. can feel unbearable. So you scroll, you distract, you replay memories, you imagine conversations that never happened. All of this looks like overthinking, but underneath it, something else is happening. Your brain is searching for a reason to shut down safely. Sleep isn't just unconsciousness, it's trust. Trust that nothing urgent will happen if you let go. Trust that tomorrow has a shape. Trust that stopping won't cost you something important. When that trust is missing, sleep becomes shallow, even if it lasts all night. This is why people can feel tired during sleep. The system never fully disengages. So tonight, instead of asking how many hours you've slept, consider a different question. What has your mind been carrying without resolution? Not dramatically, not catastrophically, just quietly. A conversation you avoided, a path you haven't chosen, a version of yourself you keep postponing. None of these need solutions right now, but they do explain something important. Your exhaustion may be information, not a flaw, not a weakness, a signal. And signals don't demand immediate action. They ask for recognition first. So as you lie here listening, you don't need to fix anything. You don't need clarity. You don't need motivation. For now, just notice this. You're not tired because you're broken. You are tired because something inside you hasn't been allowed to end. And that raises a deeper question. If the brain cannot truly rest without closure, what happens in a life that never slows down long enough to provide it? That's where this recording begins to drift next. Your brain does not rest just because your body lies down. That idea feels obvious only after you've lived through enough nights like this one, because from the outside everything looks calm, your muscles loosen, your breathing slows, your heart settles into a softer rhythm. But inside, something keeps moving, not fast, not chaotically, just continuously. The brain was never designed to stop simply because the lights went out. It was designed to predict, evaluate, connect, and prepare. And preparation does not respect bedtime. During the day, the world feeds the brain constant signals, emails, voices, deadlines, expectations. Your mind responds by prioritizing speed over depth. It postpones, it shelves, it says, later. Later becomes night. When external input drops, the brain finally has the quiet it needs to resume what it postponed. Not because it wants to disturb you, but because unresolved information behaves like an open loop. Open loops consume energy simply by existing. Imagine trying to fall asleep while holding several doors half open at once. You're not walking through them. You're not closing them either. You're just holding. That tension doesn't announce itself as stress. It announces itself as fatigue. This is why mental exhaustion feels different from physical exhaustion. Physical exhaustion asks for stillness. Mental exhaustion asks for completion. But completion is rare. Most days end without answers, without confirmation, without a clear sense that something truly ended. The brain notices. It keeps a quiet inventory, not in words, but in signals. This is where many people misunderstand overthinking. They imagine it as excess thought. Too many ideas, too much analysis. But more often, overthinking is not extra thinking. It is unfinished thinking. Thoughts that were interrupted, questions that were muted mid-sentence, emotions that were acknowledged just enough to keep functioning. At night, those fragments return, not because they grew stronger, but because the systems suppressing them finally relax. In neuroscience, there are networks in the brain that act like social filters. They help you stay appropriate, productive, and outward-facing. As fatigue sets in, those filters weaken. This is not a failure. It is a transition. The brain shifts from performance mode to integration mode. Integration is slow, it is quiet, and it does not care about schedules. So while your body is asking for sleep, your brain is asking a different question. What have we not made sense of yet? That question has weight, and weight creates tiredness without movement. This is why lying still can feel harder than staying busy. Busyness distracts the integrator. Stillness invites it. You might notice this especially if your days are emotionally neutral, but mentally full. No crises, no dramatic stress, just decisions, adjustments, small compromises, each one harmless alone. Together, they accumulate. At night, the brain doesn't replay them because it enjoys repetition. It replays them because repetition is how it tests for resolution. Did this settle? Is this safe to store? Does this require action? If the answer remains unclear, the loop continues. And loops drain energy. This is not anxiety in the traditional sense. There is no spike, no panic. Just a low, persistent hum, the kind that makes sleep shallow, the kind that makes rest feel incomplete. The body rests, the mind negotiates. And then there is another layer, one that feels even quieter. Sometimes the brain is not processing problems. Sometimes it is searching for direction. Humans often underestimate how much energy anticipation provides. When you expect something, even something difficult, your nervous system prepares. Preparation gives structure. Structure conserves energy. But when there is nothing clear to anticipate, the brain does not relax. It hesitates. This hesitation feels like fatigue. You may recognize it as that strange heaviness that appears even on days when nothing went wrong. Nothing went right either, just repetition. The brain is efficient, but it is not indifferent. It wants to know why it should stay alert. In the absence of a reason, it begins to dim itself, not into sleep, into something closer to withdrawal. This is why motivation and fatigue often appear together, not because you're lazy, but because your system is conserving energy in an environment that feels directionless. This kind of tiredness does not respond to rest. It responds to orientation, a sense, any sense, of movement toward something, not achievement, just trajectory. Without that, the brain keeps checking. Checking costs energy. At night, without distractions, this checking becomes noticeable. You may feel it as restlessness, or as a dull pressure behind the eyes, or as the urge to scroll without interest. These are not habits. They are attempts at stimulation. The brain is looking for a signal, something to confirm that it is still participating in a story. When it doesn't find one, fatigue deepens. This is why telling yourself to relax often backfires. Relaxation is not a command the brain understands. Safety is, completion is, orientation is. Without them, stillness feels exposed. So the brain stays partially awake, not alarmed, just unconvinced. And this partial wakefulness creates a specific kind of exhaustion, the kind that feels like you've been awake even while sleeping. This is not because sleep failed. It's because disengagement never fully happened. Disengagement requires trust. Trust that nothing essential is being missed. Trust that the future is stable enough to release attention. At 1 or 2 in the morning, trust is fragile, not because the night is dangerous, but because the noise is gone, and silence amplifies unresolved things. So, if you are tired right now and you cannot explain it by hours or effort, consider this gently. Your brain may not be tired of thinking. It may be tired of holding questions, holding possibilities, holding versions of yourself that haven't had a chance to settle. None of this demands answers tonight, but noticing it changes something, because fatigue that is understood behaves differently than fatigue that is fought. As you listen, you don't need to solve anything. You don't need insight. Just allow the idea to rest here. Not all exhaustion comes from doing too much. Some of it comes from carrying things that were never allowed to land. And when nothing lands, the mind keeps hovering. Hovering takes energy. So does waiting. And somewhere between hovering and waiting, the feeling we call tiredness quietly forms. There is a kind of tiredness that doesn't come from noise or overload. It comes from emptiness, not physical emptiness, not boredom in the obvious sense, but the absence of something ahead. During the day, this absence is easy to ignore. Tasks fill the hours, messages arrive, responsibilities create motion. Motion can disguise directionlessness, but at night, motion stops. And what's left is a quiet question your brain has been postponing. What is all of this moving toward? When there is no clear answer, fatigue takes a different shape. This is the tiredness of no anticipation. Biologically, the brain is not just a processor of the present. It is a forecasting system. It constantly allocates energy based on what it expects to need. If there is a challenge coming, it prepares. If there is pleasure coming, it primes reward circuits. If there is danger, it sharpens attention. Expectation creates structure. Structure reduces uncertainty. Uncertainty is expensive. When tomorrow looks like a blank extension of today, the brain cannot prepare efficiently, so it hesitates. Hesitation feels like heaviness. This is why you can feel tired even on days when nothing happened. Nothing drained you. Nothing stressed you. There was simply nothing to lean toward. This kind of fatigue is subtle. It doesn't hurt. It doesn't ache. It feels like low voltage. You wake up already depleted, not because you didn't rest, but because your system never found a reason to fully engage. This is not a motivational problem. It's an orientation problem. The brain needs a sense of trajectory more than it needs comfort. Comfort without direction can feel suffocating. At night, this becomes clear. You may notice your mind drifting, not to worries, but to vague future images, not plans, just possibilities. What if I stay like this? What if nothing changes? What if this is it? These are not dramatic thoughts. They are quiet checks. The brain is scanning for signal. When it doesn't find one, it reduces output. Fatigue increases. This is why rest can feel pointless when there is nothing to look forward to. The body may be relaxed, but the nervous system is unconvinced. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes sense. Energy is not spent randomly. If there is no perceived need to mobilize, systems downshift, not into sleep, into conservation. Conservation feels like tiredness. It is not collapse. It is withdrawal. This is why weekends sometimes make exhaustion worse. Work stops, structure dissolves, and without externally imposed direction, the brain is left alone with the question of why. If that question has no answer yet, fatigue deepens. You may lie down longer, scroll more, sleep later. None of it helps, because the tiredness is not asking for rest. It's asking for a reason. This is where many people confuse burnout with laziness. Burnout implies depletion from excess, but this is depletion from meaning scarcity. From doing things that require energy without returning orientation. You give effort. You receive continuation, no arrival. At night, the brain reviews, not the details of the day, but the direction of the pattern. Is this leading somewhere? Is this temporary? Is there a shift coming? If the answer remains unclear, the system stays in low output mode. Fatigue becomes baseline. This is not failure, it is adaptation. Your body is not betraying you. It is responding accurately to an environment that feels static. This is why forcing positivity rarely works. Telling yourself to be grateful does not create direction. It creates pressure. Pressure without direction increases exhaustion. At 1 or 2 in the morning, when the day's structure is gone, this becomes impossible to ignore. You may feel tired in a way that feels existential rather than physical. Not sad, not hopeless, just flat. Flatness is exhausting. It requires constant micro-adjustments to stay functional, smiling when nothing moves inside, responding when nothing pulls forward. The brain notices this mismatch. At night, it reduces effort. It lets the tiredness surface. This is not a sign that you are broken. It is a sign that your system is conserving energy until something makes sense again. Meaning does not have to be grand. It does not have to be permanent. The brain only needs enough orientation to justify engagement, a direction, not a destination. Without it, rest feels incomplete. Sleep feels thin. Morning feels heavy. So if you are tired right now, and the tiredness feels dull rather than sharp, empty rather than painful, consider this gently. You may not be exhausted because you did too much. You may be exhausted because there is nothing pulling you forward strongly enough to wake the system up. This kind of tiredness is quiet. It does not demand change. It simply waits. And waiting, when prolonged, costs more energy than most people realize. The brain can work through stress. It can work through fear. What drains it most is uncertainty without movement. At night, with nothing left to distract from that uncertainty, fatigue finally gets space to exist, not to punish you, but to tell the truth about what has been missing. And once that truth is noticed, the tiredness changes character. It becomes less heavy, less confusing, because fatigue that has a context no longer has to speak so loudly to be heard. You don't need answers tonight. You don't need a plan. Just allow this idea to settle. Sometimes the reason rest doesn't restore you is not because you need more sleep, but because your system is waiting for something, anything, to move toward. And until it senses that movement, it remains cautious, quietly conserving what little energy it has left. Some tiredness doesn't come from having too much in your mind. It comes from having too much unfinished. Not unfinished tasks in the practical sense. Emails can wait. Deadlines can move. This is a different category entirely. It's the tiredness created by things that never reached a natural stopping point. A sentence you didn't finish saying. A decision you delayed just long enough for it to become permanent. A version of yourself you considered, then quietly abandoned without explanation. These are not dramatic events. That's why they are so exhausting. The brain is built to recognize patterns with endings. Beginnings matter, so do conclusions. When something ends, the nervous system releases it. Energy is freed. But when something stays open, not clearly wrong, not clearly right, the brain keeps it active. It has to. Unresolved information is treated as potentially important. So it stays near the surface. During the day, you don't feel this. Your attention is divided. Your awareness is fragmented. Your mind jumps quickly from one thing to the next. Open loops are carried quietly in the background. At night, the background becomes the foreground. The brain no longer has incoming tasks to prioritize, no external signals to sort, so it turns inward, not to reflect, to audit. It checks what didn't settle, and it checks repeatedly. This is where many people mistake this process for rumination. They think the brain is obsessing, but obsession implies fixation. What's happening here is different. It's verification. The brain keeps asking, is this safe to let go of? Did this reach a conclusion? Does this still require attention? If the answer remains unclear, the loop stays open. Open loops consume energy continuously, not in spikes, in steady, invisible draw. That's why this tiredness doesn't feel sharp. It feels draining, like something is quietly plugged into you. You may notice this when your thoughts circle familiar territory without intensity. No panic, no urgency, just repetition. The same memory, the same imagined conversation, the same hypothetical outcome. This is not because you care too much. It's because the brain doesn't know what to do with ambiguity. Ambiguity is unstable, so the mind returns to it again and again, hoping for resolution. Resolution doesn't always mean a solution. Sometimes it means permission to stop processing. But permission requires certainty. And certainty is rare in modern life. We move quickly. We adapt often. We leave many things half-decided. The brain keeps score, not emotionally, energetically. Each unresolved thread is light. Together, they become heavy. This is why people often feel more exhausted after periods of nothing happening, nothing resolved, nothing closed, just continuation. At night, when your body finally stops moving, your mind notices the weight it's been carrying. It doesn't complain. It just slows everything down. Fatigue sets in. This fatigue is not a demand for sleep. It's a response to overload without closure. You can sleep through it. You can nap around it. But unless something lands, it remains. This is why people wake up tired even after long rest. The body restored. The mind still holding. Holding requires effort, even if you are unaware of it, especially if you're unaware of it. Awareness actually reduces the cost. Naming unfinished things gives the brain context. Context reduces uncertainty. Uncertainty drains energy. At night, without context, the brain searches. It revisits. It tests memories like loose tiles, not because they matter deeply, but because they never settled into place. This process feels uncomfortable when you resist it, when you label it as failure, as weakness, as inability to relax, but it changes when you see it for what it is. Maintenance. Your system is trying to clean up quietly. The problem is not that it's happening. The problem is that it's happening without boundaries. No signal tells the brain when to stop. So it keeps going, and that continuous low-level processing creates exhaustion that sleep alone cannot fix. This is where people often turn to distraction, scrolling, noise, filling the silence, not for pleasure, for interruption. Distraction breaks loops temporarily, but it doesn't close them. So the tiredness returns, often stronger, because now there is less quiet time for integration. This is not a moral failure, it's a mismatch. Your brain evolved in an environment where things ended more clearly. Hunts ended, days ended, decisions were fewer. Now most things fade instead of finishing. The brain hasn't adapted to that fully, so it works over time, at night, when everything else finally stops. If you feel tired right now, and the tiredness feels like mental fog rather than physical ache, consider this gently. You may not be exhausted because you are weak. You may be exhausted because too many things in your life never received an ending, not conclusions, endings, even small ones. And without endings, the mind keeps vigil, quietly, patiently, consuming energy while you try to rest. You don't need to solve anything tonight, but noticing this changes how the fatigue feels. It becomes less mysterious, less personal, because once you realize your tiredness is tied to what never landed, you stop fighting it. And the brain, finally understood, begins to loosen its grip. There is another kind of tiredness that rarely gets named. It doesn't come from emptiness. It doesn't come from unfinished thoughts. It comes from holding yourself together for too long. During the day, you function, you respond correctly, you choose the acceptable tone. You say, "I'm fine," without thinking about whether it's true. This isn't deception, it's regulation. Human beings are constantly adjusting themselves to fit the moment. We soften reactions, we delay emotions, we filter honesty. Most of the time, this is necessary. Society depends on it. But regulation costs energy, and the cost is rarely felt immediately. It accumulates. You may not notice it while you're busy, while conversations are happening, while expectations keep arriving, but when night comes and there is no one left to perform for, the system finally loosens its grip. This is when fatigue changes texture. Not heavy, not dull, exposed. You may feel suddenly more tired the moment you're alone, not because you did more, but because you stopped holding emotions in the right shape, holding reactions at the right size, holding thoughts back just enough to keep things smooth. This kind of tiredness often surprises people. They think rest should feel relieving. Instead, it feels revealing. Because when the effort of being okay drops, everything underneath becomes noticeable. Not overwhelming, just present. Neuroscience doesn't talk much about this in emotional terms, but the mechanism is simple. The brain uses inhibitory systems to manage behavior. These systems suppress impulses, reactions, and expressions. Suppression is not free. It requires sustained activity. As fatigue increases, suppression weakens. This is why emotions surface at night. Not because they grew stronger, but because the gate holding them back grew tired. This is also why people feel more honest with themselves after midnight. Not wiser, just less filtered. The brain is no longer spending energy on appearance, so it redirects attention inward. This redirection feels like tiredness, because maintaining a stable outward self for hours at a time is more exhausting than most physical labor, especially when nothing visibly wrong is happening. You're not in crisis. You're not breaking down. You're just quietly managing. And management without release becomes strain. At night, the system seeks equilibrium. It lets the suppressed material surface, not dramatically, gently. A thought you avoided, a feeling you minimized, a truth you postponed. These don't arrive as clear statements. They arrive as fatigue, as heaviness, as the sense that you don't want to talk anymore, even to yourself. This is why people sometimes confuse this tiredness with sadness. But sadness has direction. This tiredness is more neutral. It's the exhaustion of constant self-regulation, of being appropriate, of being stable, of being fine. The brain does not judge this effort, it simply accounts for it. And when the accounting becomes visible, the body responds by slowing everything down. You may feel your movements become softer, your thoughts less sharp, your desire to engage fade. This is not collapse. It's recovery, recovery from performance, even if that performance was subtle, even if no one noticed, especially if no one noticed. At 1 or 2 in the morning, there is no audience left, no feedback loop, no external validation. So, the system finally checks in internally, and internal checking is tiring when it's been delayed all day. This is why people often feel a wave of exhaustion the moment they stop being needed, when the phone stops vibrating, when the room goes quiet, not because they lost stimulation, but because they lost structure. And structure was doing a lot of invisible work. Without it, the nervous system has to renegotiate balance. That negotiation takes energy. So fatigue appears, not as a problem, as a signal that something has been held too tightly for too long. This tiredness does not ask for sleep first. It asks for permission. Permission to stop regulating. Permission to not respond. Permission to exist without adjustment. At night, that permission is finally available. So, the system takes it. The result feels like exhaustion. But underneath it, something else is happening. Relief, subtle, unfamiliar, because many people are not used to letting the structure fall away. So when it does, the sensation is confusing. You may feel both lighter and more tired at the same time. That contradiction makes sense. You've released effort, but the release itself reveals how much effort there was. You don't need to interpret this. You don't need to change it. Just notice it. If you feel more tired at night than during the day, it may not be because the night is harder. It may be because the night is honest. And honesty, after long periods of regulation, requires energy to surface. That energy doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from the same place you've been drawing from all day. So the body slows, the mind softens, and fatigue settles in not as a punishment, but as a quiet acknowledgement of how much you've been holding together without pause. There are forms of tiredness that only exist when everything becomes quiet, not because silence causes them, but because silence removes the last layer of cover. During the day, sound protects you. Movement protects you. Interaction protects you. Even discomfort can be softened by motion. But at night, especially after midnight, when the world thins out, there is nowhere left for certain sensations to hide. That is when a particular kind of fatigue appears. It doesn't announce itself as pain. It doesn't demand attention. It simply arrives, often slowly, often without explanation. You may notice it as a heaviness that wasn't there an hour ago, or as a sudden reluctance to move, to think, to engage. Nothing changed externally, but internally a threshold was crossed. Silence has weight, not because it adds something, but because it subtracts distraction. When there is no noise left to absorb excess mental energy, that energy turns inward, and what it meets there determines how tired you feel. This is why some people feel most exhausted not after hard days, but after calm ones. The calm exposes what activity concealed. At night, there are no urgent tasks to justify alertness, no roles to play, no expectations to meet in real time. The nervous system finally asks itself a question it has postponed. What state am I actually in right now? That question is more tiring than it sounds, because answering it requires awareness. Awareness requires energy. And if you've spent the entire day directing that energy outward, turning it inward feels draining. This is where many people misunderstand nighttime fatigue. They assume tiredness should correlate with effort, more fatigue. But the brain doesn't work that way. The brain becomes tired not only from activity, but from switching modes. Going from outward engagement to inward awareness is not a passive transition. It is a recalibration, and recalibration takes resources. During the day, your attention is fragmented by necessity. You don't feel your full internal state because you don't have to. At night, fragmentation ends. Attention gathers, and gathered attention reveals things that were previously diluted. Small discomforts combine. Minor dissatisfactions become noticeable. Unacknowledged emotions gain shape, not because they intensified, because nothing is distracting from them anymore. This is why tiredness can spike the moment the room goes dark, not gradually, suddenly, as if someone turned down the external world and turned up the internal one. That shift is destabilizing. The brain prefers gradual transitions. Day to night is abrupt, especially in modern environments where artificial light blurs the boundary. Your biology expects a slow fade. Instead, you get a switch, and the nervous system struggles to adapt, so it slows everything down. Fatigue is one of the tools it uses, not to shut you down completely, but to reduce the range of experience. When energy is low, awareness narrows. That narrowing feels like tiredness, but its function is protective. At night, the brain becomes more conservative, less exploratory, less expansive. It is trying to keep you safe during a vulnerable phase. This safety strategy worked well when nights were genuinely dangerous. Now, danger is abstract, but the system hasn't updated fully, so it still treats nighttime as a period requiring caution. Caution feels like heaviness, especially when combined with unresolved internal material. This is why fatigue deepens in silence, not because silence is harmful, but because silence removes the buffer. Another factor becomes important here. At night, time feels different. Minutes stretch, thoughts linger. Without external markers, the brain loses its sense of progression. Progression provides reassurance. It tells the system that something is moving forward. In silence, without movement, The sense of progress disappears, and without progress, the brain reduces output. This reduction feels like exhaustion, not collapse, contraction. You may notice this as a desire to simplify. Shorter thoughts, fewer choices, less stimulation. This is the nervous system conserving energy. But conservation is often misinterpreted as failure. People think something is wrong because they feel less capable at night. In reality, the system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It is lowering complexity. Complexity is expensive. Night is not the time for complexity, so the brain limits it. This limitation feels like tiredness, but there is another layer beneath this biological explanation, one that is harder to name. At night, without witnesses, you are left alone with continuity, the full stretch of your life, uninterrupted. No segmentation by meetings or meals, just existence flowing forward. This continuity can be overwhelming, not emotionally, existentially. During the day, life is chopped into manageable units. Tasks begin and end. Time feels discrete. At night, those boundaries dissolve, and the brain becomes aware of duration, of how long things have been the way they are, of how long they might continue. This awareness is subtle, but it is tiring. Duration without change taxes the nervous system. It introduces uncertainty. How long will this last? Is this stable? Is something supposed to shift? Without clear answers, the system slows down. Fatigue increases, not to punish you, to reduce exposure to uncertainty. This is why many people feel more tired on nights when they reflect on their life trajectory. Not intensely, just quietly. Thoughts like, "It's been like this for a while. I don't know when this will change. I can't tell if this is temporary." These thoughts are not catastrophic, but they lack closure. Lack of closure costs energy. At night, the cost becomes visible. Silence also removes social calibration. During the day, other people's presence helps regulate your emotional state. You mirror, you adjust, you align. At night, that external reference disappears. The nervous system has to self-regulate entirely. Self-regulation without feedback is demanding, so the system lowers intensity. Fatigue is the result. This is why some people feel lonely only at night, even if they are socially connected. Loneliness here is not about absence of people. It's about absence of regulation cues. The brain is used to co-regulating. When it has to do all the work alone, it becomes tired, quietly, gradually. This tiredness does not need fixing. It needs context. Understanding reduces its intensity. Because fatigue that is interpreted correctly no longer needs to escalate to be noticed. So, if you feel especially tired when everything is quiet, consider this. Nothing new may be happening, but a lot is being revealed. Revealed to a system that is already conserving energy. That combination feels heavy. You don't need to engage with what arises. You don't need to process it. Just letting it exist without resistance changes how exhausting it feels. Because resistance is costly. At night, costs are felt more clearly. So the system asks you not with words, but with fatigue, to simplify, to narrow. To rest attention, not just the body. This is why lying still in silence can feel more tiring than gentle noise. Noise provides structure. Silence demands internal organization. Internal organization is work, even when nothing is wrong. So as you lie here, listening, if the tiredness feels deeper than sleepiness, don't assume something has failed. Assume something has slowed down on purpose. Your system is adjusting to quiet. Adjustments take energy. That energy shows up as fatigue. And once the adjustment completes, once the system feels oriented within the silence, the tiredness begins to soften, not because it disappears, but because it no longer needs to protect you so actively. Silence stops feeling empty. It becomes spacious, and in that space, the nervous system can finally decide how much awareness it can afford to release. That decision is slow. It cannot be rushed, but it is already happening, even if all you can feel right now is the weight of being awake in a world that has gone quiet. There is a moment, usually late at night, when tiredness stops feeling physical and starts feeling personal, not dramatic, not emotional in an obvious way, personal in the sense that it feels tied to you, not to what you did. You might notice it when you think, I shouldn't be this tired. Nothing especially hard happened today. You didn't overwork. You didn't push yourself. And yet, your energy feels thin. That thought alone, I shouldn't feel this way, adds another layer of fatigue. Because now, the tiredness is no longer just a sensation. It becomes a problem to solve, and problems demand effort. This is where a quiet loop begins. The body signals fatigue, the mind questions it. The questioning increases load. The load deepens fatigue. At night, this loop becomes more noticeable, not because it started at night, but because nothing else is competing with it. During the day, tiredness is contextual. You can explain it away. At night, explanations run out, so the brain turns inward. And when it turns inward, it often turns critical, not harshly, subtly. Thoughts like, why can't I relax? Why does rest not work for me? Other people seem fine. These thoughts are not intentional, they are reflexive. The brain is trying to regain control over a state it doesn't understand. Control feels safe. But control requires analysis. Analysis costs energy. So the attempt to fix tiredness quietly reinforces it. This is why fatigue sometimes feels heavier the more you pay attention to it. Not because attention is bad, but because evaluative attention is expensive. There is a difference between noticing and measuring. Noticing is light. Measuring is work. At night, when energy is already low, measurement feels draining. The brain is asking itself, how tired am I? Is this normal? Is something wrong? Each question adds friction. This is not anxiety in the traditional sense. There is no rush, just a slow accumulation of mental effort. The nervous system senses this effort and responds by reducing output further. More fatigue. This can feel frustrating because it creates the impression that tiredness feeds on itself. In a way, it does, but not because the system is malfunctioning, because it is responding logically to increasing internal demand. At night, demand should be minimal. So when demand persists, even in the form of self-monitoring, the system downshifts. It limits energy. This limitation is protective, but subjectively, it feels like depletion. This is why people often feel most tired when they are trying to rest correctly, trying to relax, trying to sleep, trying to calm down. Each trying adds a layer of intention. Intention requires engagement. Engagement costs energy. At 1 or 2 in the morning, energy is already scarce. So even gentle effort feels heavy. This is where many people misunderstand their own nervous system. They assume rest should be active, something you do. But biologically, rest is a state you allow. Allowing is not the same as achieving. Achievement implies effort. Allowance implies permission. Permission is lighter. But permission is difficult for minds that are used to managing everything, especially minds that have spent years staying functional by monitoring themselves closely. At night, when monitoring no longer serves an external purpose, it becomes excess. Excess drains. This is why some people feel more tired the moment they stop being productive. When productivity ends, self-observation increases. How did today go? Was it enough? Did I do what I was supposed to do? These questions are not conscious evaluations. They are background processes, but background processes still use energy. At night, there is no forward momentum to carry them, so they become noticeable. Fatigue surfaces. Another layer appears here. Fatigue often carries a moral tone. People don't just feel tired, they feel bad for being tired, as if tiredness implies weakness, lack of discipline, failure to manage life properly. These judgments are learned. They come from environments where rest is conditional, where tiredness must be justified. At night, these judgments echo, not loudly, but persistently. And judgment is one of the most exhausting mental activities there is. It activates threat circuits. It keeps the system alert. Alertness and rest do not coexist easily, so the body signals fatigue while the mind resists it. That conflict is tiring. You feel both heavy and tense at the same time. This combination is particularly draining. The nervous system receives mixed messages. Shut down. No, stay functional. So it compromises. Partial shutdown, which feels like fog, slowness, low energy without relief. This is why nights can feel more tiring than days. Not because nights are harder, but because they expose contradictions. The contradiction between needing rest and not trusting yourself to rest without conditions. Trust is crucial here. Sleep requires trust. Trust that nothing urgent is being ignored. Trust that letting go is safe. Trust that you don't need to monitor yourself constantly. When trust is missing, rest becomes shallow, not absent, just incomplete. So the body remains tired. This kind of tiredness does not respond to more sleep. It responds to reduced self-surveillance. But self-surveillance is often automatic, especially for people who learned to stay safe by staying aware. At night, when awareness has no external outlet, it turns inward, and inward attention without gentleness becomes pressure. Pressure drains. This is why fatigue often feels worse when you try to check in with yourself too closely. The system is already sensitive. Extra probing increases load. So what helps is not deeper analysis. It's less demand, less expectation to fix, less requirement to understand immediately. Understanding will come later. At night, the nervous system prioritizes safety over insight. Safety comes from simplicity, lower stimulation, lower evaluation, lower effort. This doesn't mean ignoring your state. It means noticing without interrogating, letting tiredness exist without asking it to justify itself. That alone reduces load, because justification is work. At this hour, your system has already worked enough. So if you are tired right now, and part of that tiredness feels like frustration with yourself, recognize this gently. You may not be exhausted because something is wrong. You may be exhausted because you're still demanding coherence from a system that is trying to power down. Coherence can wait, clarity can wait, even meaning can wait. What cannot wait is the reduction of demand. At night, rest does not come from doing rest correctly. It comes from stopping the quiet negotiations inside. Those negotiations are subtle. They sound reasonable. but they cost energy, and energy is limited. So the body responds by slowing everything further, not to punish you, to protect itself from additional strain. When that protection is understood, fatigue softens, not instantly, gradually, because understanding removes resistance. Resistance is expensive. At night, expense is felt quickly. So you don't need to be less tired right now. You don't need to change your state. Just allow the tiredness to exist without turning it into a problem. That alone shifts something. Because the moment tiredness stops being questioned, it stops needing to insist. And when it no longer needs to insist, it begins to loosen, quietly, without effort, in the dark, where nothing is being asked of you. There is a deeper layer beneath all of this tiredness, one that doesn't come from thinking, or emptiness, or self-control. It comes from time, not the hours you spent awake, not the number on the clock, but the feeling of how long something has been going on. At night, time stops behaving politely. During the day, time is chopped into segments: morning, afternoon, evening. Meetings end, tasks close, messages get replies. Time feels manageable because it has edges. But late at night, especially after everything has gone quiet, those edges dissolve. There is no next meeting, no immediate marker, just duration. And duration is heavy. You may notice this when a thought appears that isn't urgent, but stretches. It's been like this for a while. I don't know when this will change. I can't tell if this is temporary. These thoughts are not loud. They don't panic. They simply sit there. And sitting thoughts take energy to hold. The brain is very good at handling intensity. It is less comfortable with indefinite continuation. Intensity spikes and resolves. Duration lingers. Lingering requires sustained attention. Sustained attention costs energy, so fatigue deepens. This is why people can survive extremely difficult short periods and feel more exhausted during long, quiet stretches, not because the quiet is harder, but because the system never gets a signal that something is ending. Endings release energy. Without endings, the brain stays semi-engaged. Semi-engagement is exhausting. At night, the sense of duration becomes clearer. There are no distractions left to compress time. Minutes feel longer. Thoughts take more space. The brain becomes aware of continuity, of how today connects to yesterday, of how tomorrow might resemble both. This awareness is not negative, but it is demanding, especially if nothing in that continuity feels resolved. This is where fatigue takes on a strange emotional tone, not sadness, not fear, something closer to weariness. Weariness is not about effort. It's about how long effort has been required. You may not feel overwhelmed by today, but you feel tired of the pattern. Patterns without change drain the nervous system. Change resets expectation. Expectation restores energy. Without it, energy leaks slowly. At night, with no new input, the brain reviews patterns, not analytically, somatically. It senses rhythm, and if the rhythm feels stagnant, the system slows down. Fatigue is the expression of that slowing. This is not a flaw, it's calibration. The nervous system is constantly adjusting output based on perceived environment. If the environment feels static, output decreases. Decreased output feels like tiredness. This tiredness does not mean you should give up. It means the system is conserving energy until it detects movement. Movement doesn't have to be physical. It can be psychological, a shift, a reframe, a decision. But when none of those have happened yet, fatigue is the placeholder. It holds space until change arrives. At night, this placeholder becomes obvious. You may feel a heaviness that doesn't respond to rest, because rest does not change pattern. Rest pauses effort, but it doesn't signal resolution, so the brain remains cautious. Another layer appears here. Nighttime removes urgency. Without urgency, the brain loses a powerful organizing force. Urgency compresses time. It tells the system, act now. Without urgency, time expands. Expanded time feels heavy, especially if the mind is already carrying unresolved material. This is why some people feel more tired on calm nights than on stressful days. Stress gives direction. Calm reveals lack of direction. Neither is inherently better. But the nervous system responds differently to each. At night, when urgency disappears, the system scans for other organizing signals, meaning, trajectory, completion. If none are clear, it reduces activity. Reduction feels like fatigue. This fatigue often comes with a sense of being done, even if nothing is finished, not giving up, just spent. This is the tiredness of endurance, of having stayed present for a long time without a clear point of arrival. It's subtle, and because it's subtle, people often blame themselves for it. They think they should be stronger, more motivated, less affected. But this tiredness is not about strength, it's about exposure. Long exposure to uncertainty wears systems down, not dramatically, gradually. At night, that gradual wear becomes noticeable. The brain, without distraction, finally feels the accumulated cost, so it slows. This slowing is often interpreted as dysfunction, but it is regulation. When systems detect prolonged demand without resolution, they conserve. Conservation is survival. You are not failing at rest. Your system is responding appropriately to a context that hasn't yet given it permission to fully disengage. This is why the tiredness often feels existential rather than physical. It's tied to questions of continuity. Is this going somewhere? Will this shift? How long will this be like this? These questions are not meant to be answered at night. Night is not for planning. Night is for sensing. And sensing without action can feel draining, especially for minds that are used to solving. So the system reduces sensitivity. Fatigue lowers awareness. This is protective. Lower awareness means less exposure to uncertainty. But because awareness doesn't disappear completely, you experience the in-between state. Not asleep, not fully awake, just tired. This is not insomnia. It's a transitional state, the system hovering between engagement and withdrawal, waiting for a signal. The signal doesn't have to come tonight. It often doesn't. But understanding what's happening changes how heavy it feels. Because confusion adds load. Context removes it. So if you're lying awake right now feeling tired in a way that feels connected to how long things have been unresolved, not how hard today was, recognize this gently. Your nervous system is responding to duration, to sustained ambiguity, to patterns without closure. This is not something you can think your way out of. Thinking adds duration. What helps is allowing the system to stay in conservation without interpreting that as failure. Conservation is intelligent. It keeps you from burning out completely. It holds energy until conditions change. At night, that holding feels heavy, but it is purposeful. You don't need to force meaning into this moment. Meaning comes later. Night is not for answers. It is for honesty. And the honest signal right now may simply be, this has been going on for a while. Acknowledging that reduces internal resistance. Resistance makes duration heavier. Acceptance lightens it, not because the situation changes, but because the system no longer has to argue with itself. So if tiredness feels deep right now, older than today, connected to time rather than effort, let that be enough. You don't need to define it. You don't need to justify it. Just notice that your system is tired, not because it is weak, but because it has been enduring. Endurance costs energy. At night, that cost becomes visible, and when it is finally seen without judgment, the system begins, slowly, to soften its grip, not to sleep yet, but to rest from the effort of holding on. That rest is quiet. It doesn't feel like relief. It feels like less tension around being tired. And sometimes, that is the first real rest the nervous system has allowed itself in a very long time. There is a point late at night when tiredness stops asking for explanations and starts asking for permission. Permission to stop trying to understand itself. Permission to exist without being categorized. Permission to be felt without being managed. Most people never notice this shift. They stay in explanation mode. They stay in analysis. They stay in quiet self-interrogation. And that interrogation is exhausting, because tiredness is not a puzzle meant to be solved in the dark. It is a state meant to be accompanied. During the day, the nervous system is outward facing. It orients toward tasks, signals, feedback. At night, especially in the early hours when everything is thinned out, the system turns inward by default. But inward does not automatically mean reflective. Often, it means unguarded. Without structure, without witnesses, the mind loses its scaffolding. And when scaffolding falls away, whatever was being supported becomes heavier. This is why tiredness can feel more intense the moment you finally stop doing things right. You followed the routine. You turned off the lights. You lay down. And instead of relief, you feel a wave of fatigue that seems to come from nowhere. But it didn't come from nowhere. It came from release. Release of posture. Release of readiness. Release of subtle vigilance. Vigilance is expensive. Not the sharp kind, the constant kind. The kind that keeps track of tone, timing, response, expectation. Most people live with a low level of vigilance all day long. It doesn't feel like effort. It feels like normal. At night, when the environment no longer demands it, that vigilance finally drops. And when it drops, the body notices how long it was there. The noticing itself feels like tiredness. This is not collapse. It's recalibration. The system is adjusting to a lower demand state. Adjustments cost energy, especially when they happen all at once. During the day, demand decreases gradually. At night, it falls off a cliff. The nervous system has to catch up. So it slows everything. Breathing becomes heavier. Thoughts become thicker. Movement feels unnecessary. This is the body shifting gears. But because the shift is unfamiliar, it can feel unsettling. People expect night to be gentle. They don't expect it to be revealing. But night reveals how much has been carried quietly. Another layer appears here, one that's rarely acknowledged. At night, there is no immediate future. Not tomorrow as an idea, but right now as a direction. During the day, the next hour is always coming. At night, hours stretch without instruction. This lack of instruction is destabilizing for a system built around purpose. Purpose organizes energy. Without it, energy disperses. Dispersal feels like fatigue. This is why some people feel tired not when they finish work, but when they finally have nothing they have to do. The have to disappears. With it, a major organizing force. The nervous system, suddenly without orders, defaults to conservation. Conservation feels like heaviness. At night, conservation deepens, because there is no reason to stay alert, no reason, at least, that the system can immediately detect. So it reduces output further. This reduction can feel uncomfortable if you're used to staying engaged at all times. Engagement feels safe. Disengagement feels like loss of control. Loss of control triggers monitoring. Monitoring drains energy, so fatigue intensifies. This is the paradox of nighttime tiredness. The more you try to control it, the more energy you spend. The more energy you spend, the more tired you feel. The system is not malfunctioning, it is reacting to conflicting commands. Power down. Stay aware. It cannot do both efficiently, so it compromises. Partial power down, which feels like fog, slowness, dull heaviness. Many people interpret this as failure to sleep, but it's not failure, it's transition. A transition that hasn't been completed because the system hasn't been allowed to. Allowed means trusted. Trust is the missing piece. Trust that nothing will be lost if awareness fades. Trust that rest does not require justification. Trust that letting go is not dangerous. Without trust, the system hovers. Hovering is exhausting. At night, trust is tested. Because silence removes reassurance. There are no signals coming in to say, "You're okay." No messages, no confirmations, no immediate feedback. The nervous system has to generate reassurance internally. Internal reassurance is difficult when energy is already low. So instead, the system reduces sensitivity. It lowers awareness. Fatigue increases. This is not surrender. It is self-protection. Lower awareness means fewer signals to process. Processing fewer signals conserves energy. The system is choosing survival over clarity. Clarity can wait. This is why nighttime thoughts often feel vague, not sharp, not analytical, just present. The brain is not trying to solve, it's trying to endure quietly. Endurance without structure is tiring, but it's also honest. At night, honesty replaces productivity. The system stops pretending that everything is fine. It doesn't dramatize, it just lets the tiredness show. That tiredness often carries information you don't hear during the day, not in words, in sensation, a sense of being worn. A sense of having carried more than you realized, a sense of having adapted for too long. Adaptation is one of the most energy-intensive processes the brain performs. Adapting means adjusting expectations, reactions, identity. Doing that constantly without resolution creates cumulative fatigue. At night, when adaptation is no longer required, the system finally rests from adapting. And resting from adaptation feels like exhaustion, because the contrast is stark. You notice the drop. You notice the absence of tension. Absence feels strange when tension has been constant. So the body responds with heaviness. The mind responds with slowness. This is not collapse. It is the nervous system exhaling after holding its breath for hours. You may not remember holding your breath. Most people don't. They just know how to function. Functioning quietly costs energy. At night, when functioning is no longer demanded, the cost becomes visible. This visibility is uncomfortable, but it is also temporary. Once the system recalibrates to the lower demand state, the heaviness begins to soften, not suddenly, gradually, as the nervous system realizes it is safe to stay here. safe to be unproductive, safe to be unfocused, safe to be unremarkable. Safety allows further disengagement. Further disengagement allows deeper rest. But this process cannot be rushed. If rushed, it becomes effort again. Effort drains energy, so the system resists. This is why trying to sleep harder doesn't work. Sleep is not achieved, it is allowed. Allowance requires permission. Permission requires trust. Trust requires time. At night, time feels long, but the system uses that time to negotiate its own safety. If you feel tired right now in a way that feels like exposure rather than depletion, consider this gently. Your nervous system is not asking you to do anything. It is asking you to stop asking things of it. Stop demanding coherence. Stop demanding insight. Stop demanding rest on command. Let the tiredness be incomplete. Let it exist without direction. Direction will return with the day. Night is for lowering demands, not meeting them. You don't need to change your posture. You don't need to adjust your breathing. You don't need to reach a particular state. All of that implies effort. Effort is what the system is stepping away from. So if tiredness feels thick right now, if thoughts feel slow, if awareness feels dim, that is not failure. That is the nervous system negotiating peace, quietly, patiently, in the absence of urgency. And when peace begins to feel less unfamiliar, the tiredness will change shape, not because it disappears, but because it no longer has to carry the entire weight of holding everything together. It becomes just what it always was, a signal that effort has paused, a sign that nothing is being asked of you in this moment. And when nothing is asked, the system can finally decide how much of itself it is willing to let go. For now, there is a quiet moment, usually deep into the night, when tiredness stops feeling like something happening to you and starts feeling like something revealing you. Not your thoughts, not your memories, your limits. During the day, limits are easy to ignore. Schedules push past them. Responsibilities override them. Adrenaline borrows against them. But at night, borrowing stops. And whatever has been postponed finally shows its true cost. This is the tiredness that arrives without drama. No warning, no spike. Just a gradual realization that something inside you doesn't want to keep going the way it has been. You might feel it as a sudden reluctance to engage with even simple things. Responding feels heavy. Choosing feels unnecessary. Explaining feels impossible. Nothing is wrong, but nothing wants to continue. This is not apathy. It is threshold. A threshold is not an ending. It's the point where a system says, this much was possible, and no more. During the day, thresholds are crossed all the time. You push past them. At night, thresholds become visible, because there is no longer any reward for crossing them. No praise, no progress, no distraction. So the nervous system stops pretending they aren't there. It lets the tiredness speak. This kind of fatigue doesn't ask for sleep first, it asks for honesty. Honesty about capacity, how much you can hold, how much you can adapt, how much you can delay. Most people underestimate how much energy goes into delaying themselves, delaying reactions, delaying decisions, delaying grief, delaying desire. Each delay seems harmless. Together, they form a long stretch of suspended motion. Suspension is tiring. The brain evolved to act or resolve, not to hover indefinitely. At night, hovering becomes uncomfortable, so the system signals fatigue, not to stop you forever, to stop you now. This is why nighttime tiredness often feels oddly specific. You're not tired of everything. You're tired of continuation without change. The same patterns, the same expectations, the same internal negotiations. You may not consciously think about these patterns, but your nervous system tracks them. It tracks repetition. It tracks stagnation. It tracks how often effort leads to the same outcome. And when repetition becomes dominant, energy drops, not as punishment, as feedback. During the day, feedback is overridden. At night, feedback has space. So, it arrives, quietly. You may notice a thought drifting through your mind. I can't keep doing this the same way. Not urgently, not emotionally, just factually. That thought alone can feel tiring because it implies change, and change requires energy you don't have right now. So the system chooses conservation instead. Fatigue deepens. This is not resignation, it is pause. Pause is essential for recalibration. Without pause, systems break. So the body creates one through heaviness, through slowness, through disinterest. This is why tiredness can feel protective. It narrows your focus. It reduces demand. It says nothing more needs to happen tonight. But many people resist this message. They treat tiredness as an obstacle, something to push through, something to solve. That resistance adds strain, strain adds fatigue, and the cycle reinforces itself. At night, resistance is harder to maintain, energy is lower, so the tiredness becomes more noticeable. This is where many people experience a sense of vulnerability, not fear, exposure. Without the usual layers of motivation and urgency, you are left with raw capacity. What you can and cannot do without pressure. That can feel unsettling, especially if your identity is built around endurance, around being reliable, being capable, being steady. At night, those identities loosen, and what's underneath is not weakness, it's finiteness. Finiteness is not something we practice feeling during the day, it's inconvenient. At night, inconvenience disappears. There is nothing left to maintain. So, finiteness becomes obvious, and awareness of finiteness is tiring, not because it is sad, but because it contradicts the illusion of unlimited capacity. Illusions are light. Reality has weight. The nervous system feels that weight and responds by lowering output. Lower output feels like fatigue. This is not a mistake. It's grounding. The system is bringing you back into proportion, back into a scale that is sustainable. At night, sustainability matters more than productivity. So the body shifts priorities. It doesn't care if you understand. It cares if you survive intact. So it pulls energy inward, reduces reach, limits engagement. You might feel this as a desire to withdraw even from your own thoughts. That's not avoidance, it's conservation. The mind is stepping away from endless self-referencing. Self-referencing is expensive. At night, the system can't afford it, so it quiets. Quieting feels like tiredness, but underneath it is intelligence. The intelligence of a system that knows when to stop pushing. This is why nighttime tiredness often carries relief alongside heaviness. Relief because effort has stopped. Heaviness because you notice the effort that was there. Both can coexist. That coexistence is confusing. People expect relief to feel light. Sometimes relief feels heavy at first, because dropping a load makes you aware of how much you were carrying. At night, loads are dropped all at once. There is no gradual unloading, so the sensation is intense, but temporary. Once the system adjusts to the absence of load, the heaviness softens, not into excitement, into neutrality. That neutrality is closer to rest than forced relaxation ever is. So if you feel deeply tired right now, in a way that feels connected to limits rather than effort, recognize this gently. Your nervous system is acknowledging a boundary, not to restrict you, to protect you. Boundaries reduce energy loss. They prevent collapse. At night, boundaries emerge naturally. They don't ask permission. They simply appear as fatigue. Listening to that fatigue without arguing with it allows the system to settle. Settlement is slow. It doesn't look like sleep at first. It looks like less resistance, less pressure to continue, less demand to be anything other than what you are right now. That state may feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, but it is honest, and honesty is the foundation on which real rest is eventually built. Not rest as absence of activity, but rest as alignment between capacity and demand. At night, alignment begins when tiredness is allowed to exist without explanation. And once explanation is no longer required, the nervous system no longer has to stay alert, waiting to defend itself. It can finally begin to let go, not fully, not yet, but enough to prepare for the deeper quiet that follows. There is a point when tiredness stops being about limits and starts being about identity. Not who you want to be, but who you've been required to be for a long time. During the day, identity feels stable. You know how to respond. You know which version of yourself to present. Competent, calm, capable. Even when things are uncertain, the role stays intact. Roles create momentum. Momentum hides fatigue. But at night, roles loosen, not because you choose to drop them, but because the system no longer has the energy to keep them reinforced. And when identity loosens, tiredness deepens. This is a subtle transition. You don't suddenly feel different. You just feel less able to maintain continuity. The version of you that carries the day does not want to continue into the night, so it steps back. What remains is not another role. It's something quieter, a version of you without instructions, without expectations, without a clear function. That version is rarely seen during the day. It exists mostly at night, and meeting it can be exhausting, because this version doesn't know what it's supposed to do. It doesn't organize itself around productivity or usefulness. It simply exists. Existence without purpose is heavy for systems trained to justify themselves. During the day, identity answers the question, what am I doing right now? At night, identity is asked a different question. Who am I when nothing is required of me? That question has no immediate answer, and unanswered questions drain energy. This is why nighttime fatigue can feel strangely intimate. Not public tiredness, private tiredness, the kind that makes you less interested in explaining yourself, less interested in improving, less interested in being understood. This is not withdrawal from life. It is withdrawal from performance. Performance is one of the most energy-intensive activities humans engage in, even when it's subtle, even when it feels natural, especially when it's been practiced for years. At night, the nervous system finally stops funding it, so the performance fades, and without performance, identity feels less solid. This can feel unsettling. People often mistake this feeling for sadness or emptiness, but it's neither. It's decompression, like removing a tight garment you forgot you were wearing. The relief doesn't feel light at first. It feels heavy, because your body has to adjust to a different shape. The mind has to adjust to a different center of gravity. That adjustment is tiring. You may notice this as a loss of motivation to think about the future, not because the future is hopeless, but because the part of you that plans has clocked out. Planning is a role. At night, roles go offline one by one. Planner, problem solver, caretaker, achiever. Each shutdown conserves energy, but the transitions overlap. So for a while, everything feels dim. This dimness is often misunderstood as a lack of self, but it's not absence. It's rest from structure. Structure gives shape. Shape gives direction. Direction costs energy. At night, energy is conserved by softening shape. The self becomes less defined, less sharp, less obligated. That feels like tiredness, because clarity has weight. Clarity requires effort. Ambiguity is lighter. But if you're not used to ambiguity, it can feel uncomfortable. So the system signals fatigue. Fatigue discourages action. Action would require re-engaging structure. At night, the system doesn't want that. It wants to stay unstructured long enough to reset. This reset is slow. It doesn't look like progress. It looks like inertia. Inertia is not stagnation. It's preparation. A system at rest conserves energy until it detects a reason to move again. At night, that reason is absent. So inertia increases, and with it, tiredness. This is why people often feel more tired when they finally stop chasing improvement. Improvement implies judgment. Judgment implies effort. At night, effort is reduced. So improvement narratives lose power. What remains is presence. Presence without agenda. That can feel uncomfortable because presence exposes what has been postponed, not problems, truths, simple ones, like, I've been holding this together for a long time. I don't know who I am without momentum. I'm tired of being the one who keeps going. These are not complaints. They are observations. Observations without urgency. At night, urgency dissolves. Without urgency, observations feel heavier. They sit longer. But sitting is not harmful. It's just unfamiliar. During the day, thoughts pass quickly. At night, they linger. Lingering thoughts feel like weight. But weight is not danger. It's density. The system is compressing experience. Compression reduces surface area. Reduced surface area reduces energy loss. Fatigue is part of that compression. This is why nighttime tiredness often brings a desire to simplify life. Not in big decisions, in feeling. Less wanting, less reacting, less planning. Just being. Being is not something most people practice intentionally. They practice doing. At night, being is enforced. Enforcement feels tiring. But once the system accepts it, something shifts. The tiredness becomes less agitating, more neutral, not pleasant, but tolerable. This is the point where many people expect sleep to arrive. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But whether sleep comes or not is not the main process here. The main process is identity settling. The self that worked all day is stepping aside. The self that remains does not need to prove anything. That self is quiet, not impressive, not productive, just present. Presence without demand uses very little energy, but reaching it requires letting go of roles. Letting go feels like loss. Loss costs energy, so the transition is tiring. But once the roles are fully offline, the tiredness changes. It no longer pushes. It no longer insists. It simply exists as background. This is the beginning of true rest. Not rest as sleep, rest as absence of self-maintenance. No effort to be consistent. No effort to be coherent. No effort to be someone. At night, the system gives you a brief opportunity to experience yourself without the machinery of identity. That experience is subtle. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives as fatigue, as heaviness, as a desire to stop shaping yourself. If you let that happen without trying to define it, without trying to use it, the nervous system relaxes further because it no longer has to defend a structure. It can exist without scaffolding. That state may feel unfamiliar, even slightly unsettling. But it is not dangerous. It is ancient. It is what the nervous system does when nothing is required of it. And in that state, even if sleep doesn't come immediately, something important is already happening. You're no longer spending energy on being who you think you need to be. You are just here. And being just here is the least expensive state a system can occupy. The tiredness that accompanies it is not depletion, it's release. Release feels heavy before it feels light. That's normal. The system is adjusting to a new equilibrium, one without performance, one without explanation, one where nothing needs to continue just because it always has. At night, equilibrium doesn't need to be defined. It only needs to be allowed. And allowing, without correcting, without improving, without narrating, is often the first real rest the nervous system has experienced all day. There is a kind of tiredness that doesn't come from effort and doesn't come from endurance and doesn't even come from identity. It comes from being seen by yourself for too long, not judged, not analyzed, simply seen. During the day, self-perception is fragmented. You catch glimpses of yourself in reflection, in response, in reaction. A quick check, then back to motion. But at night, especially when nothing else is demanding attention, self-perception becomes continuous. You don't just notice what you're doing. You notice how it feels to be you while doing nothing. That uninterrupted awareness is rare, and it is tiring, because awareness, unlike thinking, does not move. Thinking jumps. Awareness stays. Staying takes energy. This is why fatigue often deepens when you stop distracting yourself from your own presence. Scrolling ends. Music fades. Noise disappears. And suddenly, you are here with yourself without interruption, not in a reflective way, in a sustained way. The nervous system is not used to this. It evolved in environments full of external cues, movement, threats, tasks. Modern nights remove all of that at once. What remains is pure internal signal. Heart rhythm, breath, subtle tension, unfinished emotion. The system has to process these signals without context. That processing feels like tiredness, not because something is wrong, but because the system is now doing work it usually avoids. During the day, the brain prioritizes relevance. It filters aggressively. At night, the filter weakens, not intentionally, energetically. As energy drops, so does selectivity. More signals get through. This makes the internal world feel louder, not chaotic, dense. Density is tiring. You may notice sensations you ignored all day. A tightness you didn't name. A restlessness you postponed. A sadness that never formed words. These sensations don't ask for interpretation, but awareness of them costs energy. So, fatigue increases. This is often misinterpreted as emotional overwhelm, but overwhelm implies excess. What's happening here is exposure. Exposure without urgency. Nothing needs to be done with what's being felt, but it's being felt anyway. At night, The nervous system stops prioritizing efficiency. It allows experience to exist, uncompressed. Uncompressed experience is heavy, not because it's intense, but because it's whole. During the day, you experience yourself in pieces. At night, you experience yourself as a field. Fields require more energy to hold than points, so the system reduces output. Fatigue rises. This fatigue is not meant to shut you down completely. It's meant to narrow experience, to make awareness less sharp, to make sensation less demanding. In this sense, tiredness is a buffer. It softens perception. Without it, sustained awareness could become overwhelming. So fatigue appears as a protective layer. This is why nights of deep awareness often feel heavy even when nothing emotionally charged happens. You didn't think about anything difficult. You didn't relive anything painful. You just existed with yourself for too long. That's enough. Human beings are social regulators. We are meant to share awareness. When awareness becomes solitary and continuous, the nervous system looks for ways to lower its intensity. Fatigue is one of those ways. This is also why people sometimes feel lonely at night without missing anyone in particular. Loneliness here is not absence of others. It's absence of co-regulation. During the day, your nervous system constantly calibrates against others. Eye contact, tone, rhythm. At night, those cues disappear. Self-regulation takes over. Self-regulation without relief is tiring, especially if you've been regulating all day. This is why fatigue deepens in isolation, not emotional isolation, physiological isolation. The system is doing all the work alone, so it slows. Slowing feels like tiredness. This is not dysfunction, it's efficiency. Another subtle layer emerges here. At night, there is no future interaction to prepare for. During the day, part of your energy is spent anticipating others, conversations, responses, reactions. That anticipation organizes awareness. At night, anticipation disappears. Awareness has nowhere to go, so it turns inward. Inward attention without direction is expensive, so the system reduces clarity. Fatigue increases. This reduction is not collapse, it's containment. You may notice your thoughts becoming less articulate, less linear, less interested in conclusion. That's intentional. The brain is conserving resources. Language is expensive. Narrative is expensive. At night, the system prefers sensation over story, sensation without interpretation. But sensation alone, without meaning, can feel uncomfortable. So fatigue softens it. This is why you may feel tired in a way that's hard to describe. Not sleepy, not drained, just dulled. Dulling is a protective response. It keeps awareness within tolerable limits. The system is not trying to eliminate experience. It's trying to make it survivable. This is especially true for people who are highly self-aware. Self-awareness is powerful, but it is metabolically costly. At night, when energy is low, high awareness becomes unsustainable, so the system lowers it. The sensation of that lowering is fatigue. This is why people who think deeply during the day often feel heavier at night. Not because they are anxious, because they are aware. Awareness accumulates. Without outlets, it becomes weight. At night, that weight settles. You feel it as tiredness. This tiredness doesn't ask for sleep immediately. It asks for permission to blur, to not track every sensation, to not define every feeling, to not stay so clear. Clarity is not always rest. Sometimes rest is opacity, soft edges, fewer distinctions. At night, the nervous system moves toward that. Fatigue is the vehicle. This is why trying to stay mentally sharp at night feels exhausting. The system is actively undoing sharpness. Undoing is work, but it leads toward rest. If you resist that undoing, fatigue increases. If you allow it, fatigue transforms, not into energy, into neutrality. Neutrality is less demanding. From neutrality, sleep sometimes emerges, sometimes it doesn't. But even without sleep, neutrality is restorative. It reduces internal friction. So if you feel tired right now in a way that feels tied to awareness rather than effort, consider this gently. You may not be exhausted. You may simply be over-present. Your system is asking to soften perception, to let details blur, to stop watching yourself so closely. That request arrives as fatigue. Listening to it doesn't require action. It requires non-interference. Let thoughts lose structure. Let sensations exist without names. Let awareness drift without direction. That drifting is not losing control. It is the nervous system doing what it knows how to do when it needs rest. At night, rest does not always look like sleep. Sometimes it looks like less clarity, less commentary, less identity, less observation. That can feel strange, even unsettling. But it is safe. The system has done this many times before. You don't remember because memory also softens. That's part of the process. So if tiredness feels thick right now, as if awareness itself is heavy, trust that this heaviness is functional. It is lowering the volume of experience, not to erase it, to make space for something quieter, something less effortful, something that doesn't need you to be watching. And in that quiet lowering, without any decision on your part, the system begins to let go, not because you told it to, but because nothing is asking it to stay awake anymore. That letting go is subtle. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives as a small easing, a lessening of effort, a willingness to stop tracking. And when tracking stops, the body finally has a chance to rest from awareness itself. That rest is deeper than any instruction could create. It is the kind of rest that happens only when nothing needs to be noticed. And night, with all its quiet, is the only place where that kind of rest is even possible. There is a kind of tiredness that does not belong to the body and does not belong to the mind, but settles somewhere in between. It feels like slowness of being, not sleepiness, not exhaustion, a reluctance to move forward inside yourself. At night, this tiredness becomes clearer because the world stops pulling you ahead. During the day, movement happens even when you don't choose it. Time pushes, schedules carry you. People expect responses, forward motion is automatic. At night, that external momentum disappears. And when momentum disappears, the nervous system must decide whether to generate its own. Often, it doesn't. Generating internal momentum costs energy, especially when the direction is unclear. So the system pauses. That pause feels like tiredness, but not the tiredness of depletion. The tiredness of hesitation. Hesitation is rarely talked about as a physical state, but it is deeply embodied. Hesitation requires the system to stay alert without committing. Alertness without action is expensive, so the system lowers alertness. Fatigue rises. This is why nighttime tiredness often carries a sense of being stuck, even when nothing is actually stopping you. You're not blocked. You're suspended. Suspension feels heavy because gravity is still there, but support has loosened. During the day, support comes from structure. At night, structure fades. Without structure, the system feels its own weight more clearly. That weight shows up as fatigue. This is not a sign of failure. It's a sign that momentum was external, not internal. External momentum is efficient. Internal momentum requires meaning. Meaning is not always available. At night, meaning tends to thin out, not because life lacks meaning, but because meaning is often tied to action. Without action, meaning becomes abstract. Abstract things are harder to hold, so the nervous system stops trying. It rests from striving. Resting from striving feels like tiredness. You may notice this as a lack of desire to think about improvement. Even positive improvement feels tiring. Plans feel distant. Goals feel irrelevant. Ambition feels like noise. This doesn't mean ambition is gone. It means the part of you that sustains ambition is offline. At night, many internal systems go offline, not all at once, in layers. First urgency, then performance, then identity, then striving. What remains is a quieter state, but the transition through layers is tiring. Each layer shutting down requires energy. You don't notice this during the day because layers are reinforced continuously. At night, they collapse inward. Collapse sounds dramatic, but this is not collapse into chaos. It's collapse into simplicity. Simplicity is unfamiliar, so it feels heavy at first. Another layer appears here. At night, the future becomes vague. Not tomorrow as a calendar event, but the sense of continuation. During the day, continuation is assumed. You are in the middle of something. At night, that assumption weakens. The system doesn't know what it's in the middle of anymore, so it stops pushing. Pushing without direction wastes energy. The nervous system is conservative. It avoids waste, so it slows. This slowing feels like tiredness. This is why people sometimes feel tired when they finally ask themselves, "What am I actually doing all this for?" That question does not create energy, it consumes it, because it opens too many possibilities. Possibility without choice is exhausting. Choice requires clarity. Clarity is low at night, so the system chooses not to choose. It rests from decision-making. Decision-making is one of the most energy-intensive cognitive functions. At night, the brain withdraws funding from it. The result is a sense of inertia. Inertia feels like fatigue. This is why even small decisions feel difficult at night. What to watch, what to read, what to think about. Not because you don't care, because caring requires energy. The system is conserving. This conservation is not laziness. It is intelligence. The nervous system knows that pushing through low clarity often leads to regret, so it prevents action by making action feel heavy. That heaviness is protective. It keeps you from making decisions that belong to daylight. At night, the system is not oriented toward construction. It is oriented toward preservation. Preservation feels passive, but it is active in its own way. It is the activity of not doing. And not doing when you're used to doing feels like tiredness. You may notice this tiredness as a desire to lie still without engaging with anything. Not boredom, not depression, just stillness. Stillness without intention. This is the nervous system returning to baseline. Baseline is quieter than productivity, quieter than identity, quieter than meaning. But quieter does not mean empty. It means unburdened. At night, unburdening happens whether you ask for it or not. The body releases tension. The mind releases narrative. The self releases shape. Releasing shape feels strange because shape provides orientation. Without it, you feel less directed, less pulled. That can feel like fatigue, but it is actually absence of pull. Pull requires force. Without force, the system rests. Another subtle factor emerges here. At night, memory integration increases. The brain begins to reorganize information, not consciously, biologically. This process is energy intensive, but it doesn't feel like effort. It feels like dullness, like slowness, like heaviness, because energy is being used internally, not for thought, for consolidation. Consolidation requires withdrawal from input, so the system reduces sensitivity. That reduction feels like tiredness. This is why your thoughts may feel less sharp at night, less articulate, less interested in logic. The brain is not failing, it is busy elsewhere. It is sorting. Sorting does not announce itself. It just makes everything else feel harder. This is why nighttime tiredness can feel disproportionate. You didn't do anything to earn it, but something is happening anyway. The nervous system does not rest by stopping. It rests by changing tasks. At night, tasks shift from engagement to integration. Integration is quiet work. It feels like nothing, but it uses energy. So fatigue appears. This fatigue is often misread as emotional, but it is largely physiological. The system is reallocating resources, and when resources are reallocated, the things that lose funding feel harder. Thinking, planning, deciding, caring. These feel heavy because they are underfunded, not because they are broken. This is why people often feel emotionally flat at night. Not sad, not numb, just neutral. Neutrality is not absence of feeling. It is absence of activation. Activation costs energy. At night, energy is being used elsewhere, so activation drops. This drop is protective. It allows integration to proceed without interference. But because integration is invisible, what you feel is only the drop. You interpret that drop as tiredness. This interpretation is understandable, but incomplete. You're not just tired. You're busy in a different way. Busy without awareness. Busy without narrative. Busy without intention. That kind of busyness feels like heaviness. This is why trying to stimulate yourself at night often backfires. Stimulation competes with integration. Competition increases strain. Strain increases fatigue. So the system resists stimulation by making it feel unappealing. This is not loss of interest. It's protection of process. The nervous system is prioritizing internal work. At night, it finally has the space to do it. This is also why nights feel long, because integration is slow. It does not rush. It does not produce immediate reward. So time feels stretched. Stretched time feels tiring, but stretched time is necessary for consolidation. The system is patient. It doesn't care about your perception of time. It cares about completion. Completion at a biological level, not a psychological one. This completion does not require awareness. It only requires low interference. Fatigue reduces interference, so fatigue is functional. If you feel tired right now, and that tiredness feels like reluctance to engage with anything at all, consider this gently. Your nervous system is not asking for stimulation. It is asking for space. Space to finish what it could not finish during the day. Space to reorganize. Space to settle. That settling feels like slowness, like heaviness, like tiredness. But it is movement in another direction. Movement away from the surface. Movement toward coherence. You don't need to assist this. Assistance would be interference. Just letting the tiredness exist without trying to fix it allows the process to continue. Eventually, the heaviness softens. not into energy, into neutrality. Neutrality is the doorway to deeper rest. From there, sleep may come or it may not. But even without sleep, integration still happens. Rest still happens. Not rest of the body, rest of structure. Structure dissolves. What remains is simple: breath, weight, presence. These require very little energy. And when energy demand drops low enough, the system finally feels safe enough to let go further. That letting go is gradual. It does not feel like falling asleep. It feels like no longer needing to stay here. That state cannot be forced. It arrives only when the nervous system has finished what it needed to do. Fatigue is the sign that it is still working. So if tiredness feels deep right now and unresponsive to effort, trust that it has a purpose. It is not blocking you. It is carrying you through a transition that happens every night, whether you notice it or not. And when the transition completes, you will not feel an announcement. You will feel less thought, less tension, less need. And in that less, rest finally finds you. Quietly, without instruction, without demand, in the only way it ever truly does. There is a kind of tiredness that appears only when you stop asking what's wrong and start sensing what has been missing. Not dramatically, not urgently, just as a quiet absence. At night, absence becomes easier to feel. During the day, presence dominates. There are tasks, signals, responsibilities, things that fill the foreground. Absence hides in the background. But when night arrives and the foreground empties, absence moves closer. Not as a thought, as a sensation. You may notice it as a faint hollowness, not emptiness in the sense of despair, more like space that was never furnished. This space is tiring to notice because the nervous system prefers fullness. Fullness provides reference points. It gives the brain something to orient around. Absence offers none, so the system slows. Fatigue deepens. This is the tiredness of no anchor, not losing something but not having something to lean into. At night, many people realize they are not tired of effort. They are tired of floating. Floating looks peaceful from the outside. Inside, it is metabolically expensive. Floating requires constant micro-adjustments. No direction pulls you forward, so balance must be maintained manually. The nervous system doesn't like manual balance. It prefers gravity. It prefers being pulled. At night, when nothing pulls strongly enough, the system becomes fatigued from maintaining equilibrium. This is why tiredness can feel heavier on nights when nothing especially bad happened. Nothing also didn't happen. No movement, no shift, no arrival, just continuation. Continuation without anchor is tiring. The brain is designed to move between reference points. Before, after. Problem, resolution. Question, answer. When reference points blur, processing becomes inefficient. Inefficiency drains energy. At night, the brain notices inefficiency more clearly. There is no urgency to override it, so the system reduces output, fatigue increases. This is not withdrawal from life. It is withdrawal from aimless engagement. Engagement without orientation wastes energy. The nervous system avoids waste, so it shuts down engagement. This feels like tiredness. This tiredness often carries a subtle emotional tone. Not sadness, not anxiety. Something closer to longing without object. A sense that something should be there, but isn't. That sense is tiring because it cannot be resolved. You cannot fix an absence you cannot define. Definition requires clarity. Clarity is low at night, so the system stops trying, it rests from seeking. Seeking is exhausting. You may notice this as a loss of curiosity, not because curiosity is gone, but because the system is tired of searching without signal. Searching without signal is one of the most energy-intensive activities the brain performs. At night, the brain withdraws from it. Fatigue is the signal of that withdrawal. This is why people often feel less interested in stimulation at night, not bored, unmotivated. Stimulation requires engagement. Engagement requires orientation. Orientation is missing, so stimulation feels pointless. This is not depression. Depression is heavy with judgment. This tiredness is neutral. It simply says, there is nothing to engage with right now. Engaging anyway would be inefficient, so the system chooses conservation. Conservation feels like heaviness. Another layer appears here. At night, people often notice a quiet grief, not about a specific loss, about a life not yet lived, about paths not taken, about versions of self that never solidified. This grief is not acute, it is ambient. It lives in the space between what is and what could have been. Ambient grief is tiring because it has no clear direction, no action resolves it, no thought completes it. The nervous system responds by lowering intensity. Fatigue softens perception. Without fatigue, ambient grief could become overwhelming. So tiredness acts as a buffer. It dims the edges. This is why tiredness can feel protective even when it feels unpleasant. It limits how much absence you have to feel at once. At night, when distractions are gone, this buffer becomes necessary. You may feel less sharp, less clear, less driven. That is intentional. The system is protecting itself from unbounded reflection. Reflection without outcome drains energy, so the system reduces reflection. Fatigue makes thinking slower. Slower thinking means fewer loops. Fewer loops means less energy loss. This is intelligent regulation. Another important factor here is comparison. At night, comparison becomes abstract, not comparing yourself to others directly, but comparing the present moment to an imagined ideal. Daytime comparison is concrete. Nighttime comparison is existential. Is this all there is right now? Is this where I'm supposed to be? These questions are not meant to be answered at night. They have no answers that satisfy the nervous system, so the system stops engaging with them. Fatigue rises. This is not avoidance. It is prioritization. The brain knows that these questions require daylight. They require context. They require perspective. At night, answering them would be inefficient. So the system prevents engagement. How? By making engagement feel tiring. This is why forcing self-improvement at night feels so draining. Not because improvement is wrong, but because the system is offline for that function. Functions shut down at night, not permanently, cyclically. This cycle is biological. Fighting it increases fatigue. Aligning with it reduces strain. Alignment does not mean giving up. It means waiting. Waiting without agitation. Waiting uses less energy. At night, waiting is the most efficient state, but waiting without reassurance is uncomfortable. So fatigue appears. Fatigue lowers expectation. Lower expectation makes waiting tolerable. This is why tiredness can feel like resignation. But it is not resignation, it is suspension. Suspension is temporary. The system is holding itself in a low energy state until conditions are right for re-engagement. Those conditions are not present at night, so suspension is maintained. Another subtle shift happens here. At night, language begins to lose importance. Words feel heavier, Explanations feel unnecessary. This is because language is a tool for coordination. At night, there is no one to coordinate with, so the system reduces language activity. Reduced language activity feels like mental fatigue, but it is actually efficiency. Why spend energy on articulation when nothing requires articulation? So the brain shifts toward sensation. Sensation without narrative. Narrative is tiring. Sensation is cheaper. This is why nighttime tiredness often feels bodily, even when it originates in the mind. The system is changing modes. Mode switching costs energy. The cost is felt as fatigue. But once the switch completes, energy demand drops significantly. This is the goal. At night, the goal is not clarity. It is low-demand existence. Existence without agenda, without justification, without comparison. Reaching that state takes time, and during that time, fatigue is present. Fatigue is the sign that the system is still transitioning. So if you feel tired right now in a way that feels like longing without name, absence without story, heaviness without pain, recognize this gently. Your nervous system is responding to missing anchors, not because you failed to find them, but because anchors belong to the future, and the future is not accessible at night. Night is not for anchoring, it is for drifting, drifting safely, without direction, without demand. That drifting feels uncomfortable if you are used to being pulled, but it is temporary. As the system realizes that drifting does not require effort, fatigue softens, the body settles, the mind loosens, the need to search quiets, and in that quiet, absence becomes less sharp, not because it disappears, but because it no longer demands engagement. At night, absence does not need to be filled, it only needs to be allowed. Allowing reduces tension. Reduced tension lowers energy use. Lower energy use allows deeper rest. This rest does not announce itself. It arrives as neutrality, as stillness, as a sense that nothing needs to happen next. That sense is fragile. It cannot be forced. But it grows when nothing interferes. Fatigue helps by discouraging interference. So if tiredness feels strong right now, do not interpret it as collapse. Interpret it as the system choosing not to fight absence, choosing not to search, choosing not to fill. In that choice, energy loss stops. And when energy loss stops, something subtle but essential begins. Not sleep yet, but rest from wanting something else. That rest is rare, and it is only available when nothing is being asked of you. Night provides that condition. Fatigue is how the nervous system guides you into it, quietly, without explanation, without instruction, just by making effort feel unnecessary. And once effort becomes unnecessary, the system can finally settle into a state that requires almost nothing, where even being tired no longer feels like a problem, just a passing state in a body that has decided for now to stop reaching. There is a moment deep into the night when tiredness stops pointing backward and starts pointing inward, not toward memories, not toward explanations, toward a quiet recognition. This is not about what happened. It's about how long I've been holding myself together without pause. During the day, the nervous system is future-facing. Even when you think about the past, you do it with a forward lean. What does this mean? What should I do next? How do I adjust? That forward lean consumes energy. It feels natural because it's constant. At night, that lean disappears. There is no next action that matters immediately, no response that must be prepared. So the system stops leaning. And when it stops leaning, everything that was being counterbalanced settles downward. That settling feels like tiredness, but it is not collapse. It is vertical alignment. During the day, much of your energy is spent suspending yourself slightly ahead of the present moment, anticipating, preparing, adjusting. This creates a subtle tension. You don't notice it because it's always there. At night, anticipation releases, and without anticipation, the system feels its own weight. Weight feels like fatigue. This is why nighttime tiredness can feel suddenly profound, not because something new appeared, but because something old finally landed. You may notice this as a heaviness in the chest or a slow exhale that feels deeper than expected. That exhale is not relief. It is arrival. Arrival into the present moment without the need to move past it. Being fully in the present is metabolically expensive if you're not used to it. Presence requires awareness. Awareness requires energy. So the system compensates by lowering intensity. Fatigue is how it does that. This is why nights often feel heavier when you finally stop thinking about the future. Not because the future is frightening, but because you've stopped leaning away from now. Now has density. During the day, density is diluted by motion. At night, density concentrates. Concentration feels heavy. Another layer appears here. At night, the nervous system loses its sense of urgency. Urgency is one of the strongest organizers of energy. It compresses time, it sharpens focus, it overrides fatigue. Without urgency, energy disperses. Dispersed energy feels like tiredness. This is why you can feel more tired when nothing is demanded of you than when everything is. Demand gives structure. Structure channels energy. At night, demand dissolves. Energy spreads out. Spreading out feels like loss of intensity. Loss of intensity is interpreted as fatigue. But it is not loss. It is redistribution. Energy is no longer pointed forward. It is diffusing throughout the system. Diffusion is quieter. Quieter feels slower. Slower feels heavier. This is not degeneration. It is recalibration. The nervous system is shifting from a task-oriented mode to a maintenance mode. Maintenance is invisible. It does not feel productive, but it is essential. During maintenance, systems check themselves. Muscle tone adjusts. Hormones rebalance. Neural connections reorganize. This work happens best when nothing else is demanding attention. So the system reduces responsiveness. Fatigue rises. Responsiveness is expensive. At night, the system withdraws from it. This withdrawal can feel uncomfortable if you're used to being responsive, used to reacting quickly, used to staying alert. Alertness feels like safety. Letting go of alertness feels risky. So the system does it gradually. Fatigue is the gradient, not an on-off switch, a slope. Another subtle factor emerges. At night, there is no external validation. During the day, feedback is constant. Responses, reactions, small confirmations that you are doing something right. At night, that feedback loop disappears. Without feedback, the system has no reference for output. It doesn't know how much energy to invest, so it invests less. Low investment feels like tiredness. This is why people often feel less motivated at night, even to do things they enjoy. Enjoyment requires engagement. Engagement requires energy allocation. Without feedback, energy allocation is conservative. The system would rather save than spend. Saving feels like fatigue. This is also why nights can feel emotionally muted. Not sad, not numb, muted. Emotion is expensive. Emotion requires appraisal, expression, regulation. At night, those systems are powered down. Powering down feels like heaviness, but it is intentional. The system is not withdrawing from life. It is withdrawing from interaction. Interaction is not needed at night. Preservation is. Another layer appears in how time is experienced. At night, time feels less segmented. Moments blur. Without segmentation, the brain loses its sense of progress. Progress motivates. Without it, energy drops. Fatigue rises. This is why lying awake at night can feel draining even when nothing is happening. The brain is not receiving progress signals, so it downshifts. Downshifting feels like tiredness. Downshifting is protective. It prevents the system from wasting energy in an environment where nothing needs to be accomplished. This is where people often try to override fatigue. They reach for stimulation, light, sound, content. Stimulation creates artificial urgency. Urgency reactivates energy, but that energy is borrowed. Borrowing energy at night increases the cost later. The system knows this, so it resists stimulation by making it feel less appealing, less satisfying. That resistance feels like tiredness. This is not willpower failure. It is biological intelligence. The system is protecting tomorrow. Another important aspect of nighttime tiredness is emotional digestion. During the day, emotions are processed shallowly. There is no time to fully feel them, so they are tagged and stored. At night, the system revisits them, not individually, collectively. The emotional tone of the day is integrated. This integration does not feel emotional. It feels heavy, because integration is a background process. It does not use conscious thought. It uses neural resources. While this happens, conscious energy drops. Fatigue increases. This is why nighttime tiredness can feel emotionally charged without clear emotion. The charge is diffuse, not directed. Diffuse charge feels like weariness. Weariness is different from sadness. Sadness has content. Weariness has duration. It is the feeling of having experienced enough for now. At night, the system communicates enough by reducing capacity. Capacity reduction feels like tiredness. This is not an error. It is communication. But most people treat it as a problem. They try to fix tiredness. They ask why. Why am I tired? Why won't this go away? Those questions are understandable, but they add demand. Demand increases strain. Strain increases fatigue. So the loop tightens. At night, the most efficient response to tiredness is not inquiry. It is permission. Permission to not understand. Permission to not engage. Permission to not optimize. Optimization is a daytime activity. At night, optimization is costly. The system is not oriented toward improvement. It is oriented toward preservation. Preservation means staying intact, not progressing. Progress can wait. So if you feel tired right now in a way that feels like everything inside you is slowly settling downward, that is exactly what is happening. Your nervous system is lowering its center of gravity. Lowering reduces the chance of tipping. At night, stability matters more than speed. This lowering feels heavy because you're used to being lifted by momentum. Without momentum, you feel your own weight. But weight is not danger. Weight is grounding. Grounding allows rest. This is why nighttime tiredness often comes with a desire to lie flat. Flatness distributes weight. It reduces effort. The body is seeking equilibrium. The mind follows. Thoughts become less vertical, less goal-oriented, more horizontal. This shift is tiring at first, because vertical thinking dominated all day. But once the shift completes, energy demand drops significantly. This is when true rest becomes possible. not because you fell asleep, but because nothing inside you is trying to go anywhere. That state cannot be forced. It emerges when effort stops. Fatigue discourages effort. So fatigue is not the enemy. It is the guide. It gently pushes you away from striving and toward being. Being does not require explanation. It does not require progress. It does not require improvement. It only requires allowance. Allowance costs very little energy, so the system moves toward it, slowly, carefully. At night, slowness is safety. So if tiredness feels deep right now, as if everything inside you is settling without asking your permission, let it. Nothing is being taken from you. Something is being returned. Returned to baseline, returned to simplicity, returned to a state where nothing needs to happen next. And in that state, even if sleep does not come immediately, rest already has. Because rest is not the absence of activity. It is the absence of pressure to continue. Night removes that pressure. Fatigue ensures you do not reintroduce it. Quietly, without explanation, just by making effort feel unnecessary. And when effort becomes unnecessary, the nervous system finally feels safe enough to stop holding itself up and begin, in its own time, to let go. There is a kind of tiredness that arrives not because something is wrong, but because something has been resisted for too long. Not resisted loudly, not fought against, resisted quietly. During the day, resistance often hides behind competence. You adapt, you adjust, you comply with what is needed. You don't argue with reality. You work around it. That kind of flexibility looks healthy, but flexibility without release becomes tension, and tension that never discharges turns into fatigue. At night, when there is no longer any reason to keep adjusting, the resistance finally reveals itself, not as anger, not as sadness, as tiredness. This is the tiredness of having accommodated too much. You may notice it as a vague reluctance to keep engaging with life as it is, not a desire to escape, just a sense that continuing in the same shape feels heavy. That heaviness is not complaint. It is information. During the day, the nervous system is rewarded for accommodation, being agreeable, being responsive, being available. These behaviors reduce friction. Reduced friction conserves social energy, but internally, accommodation costs. Each small adjustment requires inhibition of an impulse. Inhibition is metabolically expensive. It uses the same systems that manage self-control. Over time, inhibition accumulates. At night, inhibition weakens, and when inhibition weakens, the cost of having inhibited becomes visible. Fatigue rises. This is not because you lack discipline. It is because discipline has been overused. Discipline is not infinite. It must be replenished. Night is when replenishment should happen. But replenishment cannot occur if inhibition remains active, so the system turns inhibition down. Turning inhibition down feels like tiredness, because tiredness reduces engagement. Reduced engagement means fewer impulses need to be inhibited. This is intelligent regulation. Another subtle layer emerges here. At night, the nervous system no longer receives immediate consequences. During the day, actions lead to reactions. You respond, someone replies. That loop keeps engagement alive. At night, the loop breaks. Without consequence, many behaviors lose meaning. Meaninglessness is tiring, not existentially, energetically. If effort does not lead anywhere visible, the system reduces effort. Fatigue increases. This is why people often feel tired when they are free to do anything. Unlimited choice removes consequence. Without consequence, effort feels unnecessary. So the system stops investing. This tiredness is not laziness, it is efficiency. The nervous system avoids spending energy where no return is detected. At night, returns are delayed, so investment drops. Fatigue is the felt experience of that drop. This tiredness often feels like a loss of desire, not just desire to work, desire to want. Wanting itself requires energy. Wanting implies direction. At night, direction dissolves, so wanting fades. This is not emotional flatness, it is energy conservation. Another important factor here is self-suppression. During the day, many people suppress parts of themselves that do not fit the moment, not because they are wrong, because they are inconvenient. Preferences, needs, boundaries. Suppression is not always conscious. It happens automatically. But suppression costs energy. The more complex your environment, the more suppression is required. At night, when the environment simplifies, suppression loses purpose, so it drops. And when it drops, the system feels how much was being held back. That sensation feels like fatigue, not because something is being lost, because something is being released. Release feels heavy at first because release reveals tension. You don't feel lighter immediately. You feel the absence of support, like stepping off a moving walkway. The body has to recalibrate. That recalibration is tiring. This is why tiredness can spike right when you finally stop pushing, not before, after. The system notices the difference. Difference costs energy. At night, differences are magnified. There is less noise to dilute them. So the tiredness feels intense, but it is temporary. Once recalibration completes, energy demand drops significantly. Another layer appears in the relationship between tiredness and control. During the day, control is rewarded. You plan, you manage, you predict. Control reduces uncertainty. Uncertainty is costly. At night, control is less useful. There is little to manage, little to predict. So control systems go offline. But if you're used to controlling, losing control feels uncomfortable. That discomfort can be mistaken for fatigue. But fatigue here is not weakness. It is withdrawal from control. Control is energy intensive. At night, the system stops paying for it. This is why many people feel tired when they stop monitoring themselves, not because monitoring was helpful, because monitoring was expensive. The tiredness you feel is the body saying, "We don't need this right now." Another subtle aspect emerges. At night, there is no social mirror. During the day, you see yourself reflected in others. Reactions tell you who you are being. At night, that mirror disappears. Without reflection, identity softens. Softening identity feels like tiredness because identity provides structure. Without structure, the system floats. Floating requires adjustment. Adjustment costs energy. So the system reduces adjustment. It settles. Settling feels heavy. This is why nighttime tiredness can feel like loss of self. But it is not loss. It is unstructured self. The self without feedback. The self without role. The self without performance. That self uses very little energy. But reaching it requires letting go. Letting go feels like fatigue. Another important dimension here is time debt. Not sleep debt, emotional time debt. Moments that required response before there was time to feel. Decisions made too quickly to digest. Experiences moved past without integration. During the day, time debt accumulates. At night, the system tries to pay it. Payment is not conscious. It happens as slowing, as dullness, as heaviness. Fatigue increases because energy is being redirected from action to processing. Processing without awareness feels like tiredness. This is why fatigue can feel disproportionate to the day. It is not about today. It is about many yesterdays. At night, those yesterdays line up, not as memories, as weight. Weight without story, weight without blame, just weight. The system lowers output to accommodate it. Another subtle phenomenon emerges. At night, hope becomes abstract. During the day, hope is attached to tasks. If I do this, then that. At night, tasks disappear. Hope loses its anchor. Unanchored hope is tiring. It creates open-ended expectation. Expectation without path drains energy. So the system suspends hope temporarily. Suspension feels like tiredness. This is not despair. Despair is active. This is pause. Pause is neutral. But neutrality feels heavy if you are used to emotional charge. At night, charge dissipates. Charge dissipating feels like fatigue. This is why people sometimes mistake nighttime tiredness for emotional decline. But it is not decline. It is discharge. Discharge of accumulated tension. Discharge of maintained identity. Discharge of suppressed impulses. Discharge of held expectations. Discharge feels like tiredness because energy is leaving structures that required it. Those structures were invisible during the day. At night, their absence becomes noticeable. Another key point: fatigue is not always a signal to stop. Sometimes it is a signal that stopping has already begun. The system is ahead of awareness. It has already shifted modes. Awareness catches up later, so you feel tired for no reason. But there is a reason. It is just not conscious. At night, the nervous system prioritizes integrity. Integrity means staying whole, not pushing, not fragmenting, so it reduces fragmentation. Fragmentation reduction feels like tiredness because fragmentation supported activity. Without it, activity feels impossible. That is intentional. The system is protecting itself. This is why trying to override nighttime fatigue often leads to restlessness. You stimulate. The system resists. Resistance increases strain. Strain increases fatigue, so the tiredness becomes louder. Not because you are failing, because the system is defending rest. Rest is not sleep. Rest is non-resistance. Non-resistance is low energy. At night, the system moves toward it. Fatigue is the guide. So if you feel tired right now in a way that feels like quiet refusal, not refusal of life, but refusal of continuation without adjustment, recognize this gently. Your nervous system is signaling that accommodation has reached its limit, not permanently, for tonight. That limit is healthy. Ignoring it would cost more later. Listening to it costs less now. Listening does not mean acting, it means not pushing. Letting the tiredness exist without assigning meaning, without demanding change, without planning resolution. Just allowing it to be. That allowance removes resistance. Resistance is the most expensive part. When resistance drops, energy loss slows. The system stabilizes. Stabilization feels like calm heaviness. From there, deeper rest becomes possible. Not immediately, but gradually, because the system trusts what is happening. Trust reduces vigilance. Reduced vigilance allows disengagement. Disengagement allows integration. Integration allows recovery. This chain does not require effort. It requires absence of interference. Fatigue discourages interference. That is its function. So if tiredness feels strong right now, do not ask it to explain itself. It is not here to teach. It is here to protect. Protect your system from continuing in a shape that has already cost enough. Night is when protection takes precedence over performance. Fatigue ensures that, quietly, without argument, just by making everything else feel unnecessary. And when everything else feels unnecessary, the nervous system finally has the conditions it needs to settle, not into sleep yet, but into a state where nothing is being forced. From that state, sleep sometimes follows. Sometimes it doesn't. But either way, rest has already begun. Because rest is not something you do. It is something that happens when nothing inside you is being asked to continue resisting. There is a kind of tiredness that does not come from effort and does not come from resistance, but from carrying expectation without feedback, not expectations placed on you by others. Those are loud. This is quieter. The expectation you carry inside that something should feel different by now. During the day, expectation hides behind activity. As long as you are moving, it feels like progress is happening somewhere. Movement creates the illusion of direction. At night, movement stops, and expectation is left standing alone. That is when tiredness changes shape. It becomes less about what you did and more about what hasn't responded. You waited, you adapted, you stayed patient, and yet nothing clearly answered back. No signal that says, yes, this is working. Yes, this is enough. Yes, you can stop holding now. Expectation without feedback is one of the most draining states a nervous system can be in, because it requires continuous readiness. Readiness is expensive. You stay slightly alert, slightly prepared, slightly open. You don't fully commit. You don't fully withdraw. You wait. Waiting, when brief, is tolerable. Waiting, when prolonged, becomes fatigue. At night, the nervous system notices how long it has been waiting, not in dates or numbers, in sensation, a low-grade tension that never fully resolved. That tension does not announce itself as stress. It announces itself as tiredness. You may notice this tiredness as a reluctance to imagine the future too clearly. Not fear, just disinterest. The system has learned that imagining without response costs energy, so it stops investing. This is not loss of hope, it is withholding. Withholding is a protective behavior. When feedback is missing, the system conserves resources. Fatigue is the signal of that conservation. Another layer appears here. At night, the nervous system becomes more sensitive to delay. Not delay as inconvenience, but delay as pattern. The sense that effort and response are no longer tightly coupled. You do things, time passes, the result is unclear. This loosening of cause and effect is destabilizing. The brain prefers tight loops. Action, response. Tight loops reinforce motivation. Loose loops drain it. At night, loose loops become more visible because there is no new input to refresh them. So the system downshifts. Fatigue increases. This is not a failure of motivation. It is an accurate reading of the environment. Another subtle factor is self-trust. During the day, self-trust is often outsourced. You rely on schedules, on expectations, on roles. They tell you when to act. At night, that scaffolding disappears. Self-trust must come from within. But if you've been waiting for external confirmation, internal trust feels thin. Thin trust requires vigilance. Vigilance drains energy, so the system reduces vigilance. Fatigue rises. This is why tiredness can feel especially strong when you finally have nothing telling you what to do next. Not because you don't know, but because knowing would require energy you're no longer willing to spend without return. The nervous system is making a calculation. Is it worth staying ready right now? At night, the answer is usually no, so readiness dissolves. Dissolution feels like heaviness. Another layer shows up in the way time is experienced. At night, future-oriented thinking loses momentum, not because the future doesn't matter, but because there is no immediate way to interact with it. Interaction gives thinking energy. Without interaction, thinking becomes abstract. Abstract thinking is expensive, so the system withdraws from it. Fatigue increases. This is why planning at night feels draining, not because planning is bad, because planning is a high-energy activity being attempted in a low-energy state. The mismatch creates strain. Strain feels like tiredness. The system is not rejecting planning forever. It is postponing it. Postponement is intelligent. Another subtle dimension is hope regulation. Hope is not just an emotion. It is a physiological state. It mobilizes energy. It opens attention. It prepares the system for engagement. But hope must be modulated. Too much hope without reinforcement leads to exhaustion. At night, the system reduces hope intentionally. This can feel like flatness. But it is not despair. It is regulation. The nervous system is protecting itself from spending energy on signals that may not come. This is why tiredness can feel heavier after days of waiting. Not dramatic waiting, quiet waiting, waiting without complaint. At night, the cost of that waiting becomes visible. Another layer appears in self-explanation. During the day, you often explain your choices to yourself. Why you're doing what you're doing, why it makes sense. These explanations keep motivation alive. At night, explanations lose force. They sound thin, not wrong, just insufficient. This insufficiency is tiring because maintaining explanation without conviction costs energy. So the system lets explanation fade. Fatigue increases. This is not loss of meaning. It is suspension of narrative. Narrative is expensive. At night, the system saves energy by stepping out of story. Stepping out of story feels like tiredness because story gives orientation. Without it, you feel less directed, less pulled. That lack of pull feels heavy. Another subtle phenomenon emerges. At night, the nervous system is more honest about return on investment. During the day, effort is justified by obligation. At night, obligation dissolves. Only return remains. If return is unclear, effort stops. Fatigue appears. This is not cynicism, it is biological economy. The system avoids waste. Waste drains energy, so tiredness is not laziness, it is efficiency. This is why nighttime fatigue often carries a quiet clarity. Not insight, but truth. A truth that does not demand action, just acknowledgement. Like, this has been costing more than it's giving back. I've been staying open without response. I don't want to keep waiting like this tonight. These are not conclusions. They are sensations. The system is recalibrating its openness. At night, openness decreases. Boundaries soften inward, not outward. You become less available to possibility. That feels like tiredness, but it is a healthy contraction. Contraction allows recovery. Another layer appears in the body. Muscle tone drops, posture softens. These changes signal safety. Safety allows deeper disengagement, but disengagement feels strange if you're used to staying ready. So the sensation is interpreted as fatigue, not relaxation, yet. Relaxation comes later. Fatigue is the doorway. This doorway does not open by effort. It opens by allowing readiness to dissolve. If you resist that dissolution, fatigue intensifies. If you allow it, fatigue changes texture. It becomes quieter, less insistent. This is the point where the system is no longer asking for response. It is simply settling. Settling is slow. It does not feel like relief at first. It feels like nothing happening. Nothing happening is unfamiliar, so it feels heavy. But heaviness here is stability. The system has stopped reaching, stopped preparing, stopped waiting for now. That pause is restorative, even if sleep does not come, because restoration is not only about unconsciousness, it is about ending readiness. Ending readiness saves enormous energy. At night, the system seeks that ending. Fatigue ensures you don't restart readiness accidentally by making engagement feel unappealing. So if tiredness feels deep right now in a way that feels tied to waiting, to expectation without answer, to openness that never quite closed, recognize this gently. Your nervous system is no longer willing to stay ready without feedback. That is not a failure. It is wisdom. For tonight, readiness is not required. Nothing is asking for it. So the system lets it go. Letting go feels like tiredness. But underneath it, something essential is happening. Energy loss stops. Recovery begins. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. In the absence of expectation, in the absence of readiness, in the absence of the need to stay open a little longer. Night gives permission to close, not permanently, just enough. And that closing is what finally allows the system to rest from waiting. From there, sleep may come, or it may not. But either way, the cost has stopped accumulating, and that alone is already rest. There is a kind of tiredness that arrives only after you stop believing that pushing a little more will change how you feel. Not hopelessness, not surrender, just a quiet realization. Effort is no longer the missing piece. During the day, effort is the default solution. If something feels off, you adjust. If energy drops, you push. If clarity fades, you try harder to think. Effort works until it doesn't. At night, the nervous system makes this clear. You can feel it in the body first. Muscles no longer respond eagerly. Posture collapses without resistance. Breath becomes slower, deeper, heavier. The system is no longer cooperating with effort, not out of defiance, out of completion. Completion does not mean things are finished. It means effort has reached its useful limit for now. This is the tiredness of no leverage. No action seems capable of improving the moment. So the system stops proposing actions. Fatigue appears. This is not collapse. It is decision. The nervous system has decided that further effort would be wasteful. Wasteful effort increases strain. Strain reduces recovery. So the system cuts effort off at the source by making it feel impossible. This is why nighttime tiredness can feel absolute, not dramatic, just final. You don't argue with it. You don't negotiate. You simply feel unable to continue. That inability is not weakness. It is regulation. Another layer emerges here. At night, the nervous system becomes more honest about the difference between motion and progress. During the day, motion is rewarded. You move, you respond, you engage. Movement feels like progress even when nothing changes. At night, movement loses its disguise. You can feel the difference. Scrolling feels empty. Thinking feels circular. Planning feels premature. Motion without progress drains energy. The system recognizes this, so it stops supplying energy to motion. Fatigue is the result. This is why you may feel tired, even while your mind is still active. Thoughts continue, but they lack propulsion. They don't lead anywhere. The system has withdrawn power. Not because thinking is wrong, because thinking without progress is inefficient. Another subtle shift occurs. At night, the nervous system stops prioritizing outcomes. During the day, outcomes justify effort. At night, outcomes are too distant. The system cannot cash them in, so it stops investing. Fatigue rises. This tiredness often feels like a loss of will, not desire. Will, the capacity to initiate. Initiation requires energy. Energy is conserved. This is why starting anything new at night feels heavy, even pleasant things. Pleasure requires engagement. Engagement requires energy. The system is not interested, not because it doesn't care, because it is conserving. Another layer appears in how the self is experienced. At night, the sense of agency softens. You don't feel as responsible for directing experience. Things happen. You don't make them happen. This reduction in agency can feel unsettling. Agency is associated with control. Control feels safe. Letting agency fade feels risky. So the system introduces fatigue to prevent unnecessary action. Fatigue reduces agency gently, without confrontation. Another important aspect here is neural saturation. Throughout the day, the brain processes enormous amounts of information, even when nothing feels intense. Micro decisions, micro adjustments, micro evaluations, each one uses neural resources. By night, many of these systems are saturated. Saturated systems cannot respond effectively. Rather than forcing them, the nervous system lowers demand. Lower demand feels like tiredness. This is why mental fatigue feels different from physical fatigue. Physical fatigue asks for rest. Mental fatigue asks for cessation of demand. At night, cessation is possible, so the system enforces it. Another subtle phenomenon emerges. At night, the nervous system loses interest in explanations. Explanations are tools for action. They help you decide what to do next. At night, there is no next. So explanations feel unnecessary. This can feel like confusion, but it is not confusion. It is irrelevance of explanation. The system does not need to know why. It only needs to stop. Stopping does not require understanding. Understanding requires energy, so fatigue appears. This is why trying to figure yourself out at night often feels draining, not because insight is impossible, because insight is mistimed. The system is not oriented toward integration of meaning. It is oriented toward shutdown of effort. Another layer appears in the emotional field. At night, emotions lose sharpness, not because they disappear, but because emotional amplification is expensive. The system lowers amplification. Fatigue increases. This is why nighttime tiredness often feels emotionally flat, not numb, just quiet. Quiet is cheaper than intensity. At night, cheap states are preferred. Another aspect is sensory narrowing. At night, sensory systems reduce sensitivity. Vision dims, hearing softens, touch becomes less precise. This narrowing conserves energy, but narrowing feels like heaviness, like dullness, like fatigue. The system is turning down resolution. High resolution is expensive. At night, low resolution is sufficient. This is why you may feel less interested in detailed thought or fine distinctions. The system is not capable. It is unwilling. Unwillingness here is intelligent. It prevents overuse. Another subtle shift happens with memory. At night, memory retrieval slows, not because memory is lost, because retrieval costs energy. The system prioritizes consolidation over recall. Consolidation is internal. Recall is interactive. At night, internal processes dominate. So recall weakens. Fatigue appears. This is why thinking back over the day can feel effortful at night. The system is not designed for review at this hour. Review belongs to daylight. Night belongs to reset. Another layer emerges in how the future is felt. At night, the future becomes less concrete, not frightening, distant. Distance reduces urgency. Reduced urgency lowers energy. Fatigue follows. This is not loss of hope. It is suspension of projection. Projection is expensive. At night, projection is paused. Another important point, fatigue at night is not something to overcome. It is something to cooperate with. Cooperation means not adding demand, not asking questions, not trying to improve the state, just letting the system complete its withdrawal. Withdrawal is not avoidance, it is maintenance. Maintenance prevents damage. At night, maintenance takes priority, so the system disables effort. Fatigue is the mechanism. This is why pushing through nighttime fatigue often leads to restlessness rather than productivity. The system resists. Resistance increases discomfort. Discomfort increases fatigue. The loop reinforces. The exit is not more effort. It is less. Less intention, less analysis, less ambition. Letting thoughts wander without direction. Letting attention blur. Letting sensations exist without interpretation. These are all low-demand states. The system moves toward them naturally. Fatigue helps. If you allow fatigue to be present without turning it into a problem, it begins to soften, not into energy, into passivity. Passivity is not helplessness, it is permission for the system to stop trying. Trying is the most expensive thing the nervous system does. At night, it stops funding it. This stopping can feel like giving up, but it is not giving up on life. It is giving up on forcing this moment. This moment does not need force. Nothing needs to be achieved. Nothing needs to be fixed. Nothing needs to be clarified. That is what the nervous system is telling you through tiredness. So if you feel deeply tired right now, in a way that feels like effort has lost meaning, recognize this gently. Your system has reached the end of usefulness for effort tonight. That end is not failure, it is boundary. Boundaries protect energy. Protected energy recovers faster. Recovery happens best when no one is watching, including you. So let the tiredness exist without explanation. Let effort fall away. Let the system do what it knows how to do when nothing is being asked of it. It will not collapse. It will settle. And in that settling, even if sleep does not come immediately, something essential is already happening. Energy is no longer leaking through effort. And when energy stops leaking, rest begins. Quietly, without instruction, without narrative, in the only way it ever truly does. There is a kind of tiredness that doesn't feel like heaviness anymore. It feels like distance, not distance from others, distance from urgency, distance from the need to stay involved. At night, this distance grows naturally. During the day, closeness is required. You stay close to tasks, close to problems, close to outcomes. Closeness costs energy. It demands constant adjustment. At night, that demand disappears, and with it, the reason to stay close. So the nervous system pulls back, not dramatically, Almost imperceptibly, you may notice it as a feeling that things no longer matter in the same way. Not that they don't matter at all, just that they don't need you right now. This shift is subtle, but it changes the texture of tiredness completely. You're no longer tired because you're drained. You're tired because engagement has been suspended. Suspension feels strange if you're used to being involved. Involvement gives shape to time. Without it, time loosens. Loose time feels slow. Slow feels tiring. This is not boredom. Boredom still wants stimulation. This tiredness doesn't. It's closer to disinterest without judgment, a soft disengagement. The nervous system is reducing proximity to experience. Proximity requires energy. Distance conserves it. At night, conservation wins. This is why you may feel less reactive. Thoughts still appear, but they don't pull you in. Emotions still exist, but they don't demand expression. This is not suppression. It's decoupling. Decoupling is a protective process. It allows systems to rest without eliminating content. Content stays. Attachment loosens. That loosening feels like tiredness, because attachment is where effort lives. Another layer emerges here. At night, the nervous system loses interest in resolution. Resolution implies action. Action implies cost. At night, cost is minimized. So, unresolved things stop asking to be resolved. They don't disappear, they just stop pressing. This is why problems can feel less sharp at night, even if they return in the morning. The system is not fixing them, it's shelving them. Shelving costs less energy than carrying. Fatigue appears during the transition. Transition always costs energy. But once shelving completes, demand drops sharply. This is when tiredness starts to feel quieter, less urgent, less heavy, more distant. Another subtle shift happens with the sense of self. At night, the self becomes less central. Not erased, just less involved. During the day, the self is the operator. At night, the self becomes an observer. Observation without control uses less energy, but the shift from operator to observer is tiring. It feels like stepping back from the steering wheel. Relinquishing control always costs energy up front, but it saves energy afterward. Fatigue marks that shift. This is why nighttime tiredness often feels like withdrawal, not withdrawal from life, withdrawal from management. Management is expensive. The nervous system stops paying for it. Another layer appears in how thoughts behave. Thoughts become less linear, less purposeful. They drift. Drifting is not dysfunction, it's low-energy cognition. The brain is reducing goal-directed processing. Goal-directed processing costs energy. Drifting uses less. But the transition feels uncomfortable if you expect clarity. So the experience is interpreted as fatigue. This is also why reading, planning, or problem-solving feels harder at night. Those activities require tight coupling between attention and outcome. At night, coupling is loosened, so effort doesn't stick. This is not loss of intelligence, it is mode change. Another important factor here is emotional distancing. At night, emotions are not amplified, they are backgrounded. This is not numbness, it is buffering. The nervous system is creating space between sensation and response. Response costs energy. Space reduces cost. That space feels like tiredness. Because intensity drops, intensity feels like aliveness. So its absence can feel like loss. But it is not loss, it is rest from intensity. Another subtle phenomenon emerges. At night, the nervous system stops checking. Checking is constant during the day. Am I doing this right? Is this okay? What's next? Checking consumes energy. At night, checking fades. When checking stops, the system notices how much energy it was using. That noticing feels like tiredness, not because something new happened, because something old stopped. This is why tiredness can feel sudden, not gradual. One moment you're fine, the next, you're deeply tired. That moment is often when checking shuts down. The nervous system no longer asks, it rests. Rest from checking feels like heaviness, but it is relief. Another layer appears with social presence. At night, you're not being seen, not in the social sense, in the regulatory sense. You don't have to calibrate yourself to anyone. Calibration is energy intensive. Without it, energy demand drops. Fatigue appears during the drop, but once the system adapts, the tiredness softens. This is why people often feel most tired when they are finally alone, not lonely, unobserved. Unobserved states allow deeper disengagement, but the transition is tiring. Another important point, distance does not mean detachment forever. It is temporary. The nervous system cycles between engagement and withdrawal. Night favors withdrawal. Day favors engagement. Neither is better. Both are necessary. Fatigue is the signal that the system is shifting toward withdrawal. Fighting that shift keeps the system half engaged. Half engagement is exhausting. Full withdrawal is restful. So the fastest way through nighttime fatigue is not to resist it. It is to allow distance to form. Let thoughts pass without following them. Let sensations exist without responding. Let emotions be present without meaning. This is not avoidance. It is biological rhythm. At night, the system does less thinking, less reacting, less identifying. Doing less feels strange if you equate aliveness with activity. But aliveness has different forms. Nighttime aliveness is quiet. It does not sparkle, it settles. Another subtle layer appears. At night, the nervous system becomes more tolerant of incompleteness. During the day, incompleteness creates tension. At night, it is acceptable. Nothing needs to finish. Nothing needs to resolve. This tolerance reduces pressure. Pressure drains energy. So fatigue decreases after initial settling. This is why the first phase of nighttime tiredness often feels heavier than later phases. The system is negotiating tolerance. Once tolerance is established, energy demand drops. The tiredness changes character. It becomes background, not insistent, not urgent, just present. This is the point where many people fall asleep, not because they tried, but because there is nothing left pulling them into engagement. Sleep is not something you do. It is something that happens when engagement ends completely. Fatigue helps end engagement. So if tiredness feels deep right now, in a way that feels like you're stepping back from your own life for a moment, that is exactly what is happening. The nervous system is creating distance so it can rest. Distance is not abandonment. It is maintenance. Maintenance prevents damage. At night, maintenance is prioritized. Fatigue ensures compliance, not by force, by making involvement feel unnecessary. Once involvement fades, the system relaxes further, muscle tone drops, breath deepens, thoughts lose edges. This is not loss of consciousness, it is loss of investment. Investment returns with daylight. For now, it is not needed. So let the distance exist. You don't need to name it. You don't need to interpret it. Just notice that nothing is asking you to be close right now. Nothing needs your response. Nothing needs your attention. That absence of demand is the most restful condition a nervous system can have. Fatigue is the sign that the system has recognized it, and once recognized, the tiredness no longer has to insist. It becomes simply the background state of a system that has stopped reaching for tonight. There is a final kind of tiredness that appears late at night, after distance has formed, after effort has stopped, after involvement has softened. It doesn't feel heavy anymore. It feels quietly decisive, not a decision made in words, not a conclusion, more like a biological agreement. Nothing more needs to happen tonight. This tiredness does not argue. It does not complain. It does not ask to be understood. It simply closes the door. During the day, doors stay open by default. Possibilities remain accessible. Options stay available. Attention stays distributed. That openness is useful, but openness is costly. At night, the nervous system begins to close doors one by one, not permanently. Selectively, the door to action, the door to explanation, the door to improvement, the door to anticipation. Each door closed reduces demand. Demand reduction feels like tiredness, but this tiredness is different. It is not depletion. It is completion of the day's capacity. Capacity is not infinite. It expands and contracts rhythmically. At night, contraction is healthy. This is where many people misunderstand nighttime fatigue. They treat it as something to push through, but this tiredness is not an obstacle. It is a signal that the system has reached coherence. Coherence does not mean clarity. It means alignment. Alignment between energy availability and expectation. At night, expectation must drop to match energy. When expectation drops successfully, the system settles. This settling feels like a gentle finality, not sadness, not relief, just enough. You may notice this as a loss of interest in even thinking about being tired. Earlier in the night, tiredness demanded attention. Now, it fades into the background, not gone, integrated. This is the nervous system saying, we're done negotiating. Negotiation costs energy. Ending negotiation saves it. That saving allows the system to move into its lowest demand state. This state is not yet sleep. It is pre-sleep neutrality, a state where nothing is being monitored, nothing is being optimized, nothing is being resisted. This neutrality is fragile. It cannot coexist with effort, so the system guards it. Fatigue becomes a boundary. If you try to cross it by thinking harder, by stimulating yourself, by re-engaging, the tiredness returns more forcefully, not as punishment, as protection, protection of neutrality. Another subtle layer appears here. At night, the nervous system releases its attachment to meaning-making. Meaning-making is expensive. It requires narrative, context, evaluation. During the day, meaning-making helps guide behavior. At night, behavior is irrelevant, so meaning-making shuts down. This can feel like emptiness if you expect life to always feel meaningful. But it is not emptiness. It is suspension of interpretation. Suspension saves energy. This is why nighttime tiredness often feels philosophical, without conclusions. Questions may appear, but they do not demand answers. They float. Floating thoughts cost less energy than directed thinking. Fatigue encourages floating. Another layer emerges in the body. Breathing becomes less managed. You stop noticing whether it's deep enough or calm enough. Management ends. Management ending is restful, but the transition feels like tiredness. Muscles no longer hold posture. Gravity takes over. Gravity is efficient. Holding yourself against gravity costs energy. Letting gravity work feels heavy. but it is less work. This is why the body prefers lying down at night, not because it is weak, because it is economical. Another subtle phenomenon emerges. At night, the nervous system stops scanning for threat. During the day, threat detection runs constantly, even in safe environments. Threat detection keeps you responsive. Responsiveness costs energy. At night, threat detection reduces. Safety is assumed. When threat detection drops, arousal drops. Lower arousal feels like tiredness, but it is actually safety being acknowledged. This is why nighttime fatigue often comes with a sense of vulnerability, not danger, exposure. Without vigilance, you feel unarmored. That can be uncomfortable. So the system deepens fatigue. Fatigue lowers awareness. Lower awareness protects vulnerability. This is intelligent. Another layer appears in how memories behave. At night, memory retrieval becomes non-linear. Fragments surface, then fade. There is no attempt to organize them. Organization costs energy, so the system allows memory to drift. Drifting memory feels like mental tiredness, but it is part of consolidation. Memories are being repositioned, not reviewed. This repositioning happens best when attention is low. Fatigue lowers attention, so fatigue assists memory processing. Another subtle shift happens with identity. At night, the identity that says, "I should," disappears. What remains is, "I am." I am without descriptor. This is the lowest energy identity state. No role, no task, no obligation. Reaching it requires letting go of self-definition. Self-definition costs energy. So fatigue appears as the cost of letting go. But once the letting go completes, energy demand drops significantly. This is the point where tiredness stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like permission. Permission to not be anything. Permission to not continue. Permission to not care. For now. This is not apathy. It is rest from self-maintenance. Self-maintenance is one of the most exhausting ongoing tasks humans perform. At night, the system suspends it. Fatigue ensures you do not restart it. Another important aspect here is time perception. At this stage of the night, time loses urgency entirely. Minutes stretch, but they don't pressure. The future feels distant. The past feels irrelevant. Only the present remains. The present without demand uses very little energy. This is the closest the waking mind comes to true rest. It is not exciting. It is not meaningful. It is not productive. It is simply sustainable. This sustainability is what the nervous system seeks. Everything earlier in the night was preparation for this state. The thinking, the heaviness, the distance, the fatigue. They were not problems. They were steps. Steps toward reducing demand to the lowest possible level. Once demand is low enough, sleep can happen. But sleep is not guaranteed, and it does not need to be, because even without sleep, this low demand state is restorative. It allows systems to reset. Hormonal rhythms adjust, neural networks reorganize, muscle tone equalizes. All of this happens quietly. You do not feel it. What you feel is simply nothing needs you. That feeling is rare. During the day, something always needs you. At night, the nervous system creates a window where that is no longer true. Fatigue guards that window. Another subtle layer appears. At night, the nervous system stops negotiating with discomfort. During the day, discomfort triggers action. At night, discomfort is tolerated. Tolerance uses less energy than action. So, the system chooses tolerance. Tolerance feels like stillness. Stillness feels like tiredness. But stillness is where recovery happens. This is why the body prefers to remain still at night. Movement costs energy. Stillness allows redistribution. Another phenomenon emerges. At night, the system lets go of shoulds. Shoulds are cognitive constructs. They motivate action. They justify effort. At night, shoulds are irrelevant. Letting go of shoulds feels relieving, but also disorienting. Disorientation is tiring. But once orientation is no longer expected, the tiredness softens. The system settles into acceptance. Acceptance does not feel like happiness, it feels like neutrality. Neutrality is the lowest energy emotional state. This is why nighttime tiredness often feels emotionally blank, not empty, neutral. Neutrality allows recovery. This is the end point the nervous system is aiming for. Everything before was transition. So if you feel tired right now in a way that feels final, quiet, non-negotiable, recognize this gently. Your system has completed its work for the night, not work in the sense of tasks, work in the sense of downshifting. Downshifting takes time. It takes signals. Fatigue is one of those signals. Now nothing is being asked. Nothing is being prepared. Nothing is being managed. The system has arrived at its lowest cost state. From here, sleep may come, or it may not. But either way, the most important thing has already happened. The pressure to continue has ended. And when pressure ends, energy stops leaking. That alone is rest. Real rest. Not rest you earn. Rest that arrives when nothing is required. This state cannot be forced. It can only be allowed. Fatigue ensures allowance. It closes the door to unnecessary engagement. So if your eyes are still open, if your mind is still faintly aware but everything feels distant, that is not failure. That is the nervous system saying, we're safe enough now. Safe enough to stop. Safe enough to not reach. Safe enough to let go of the last thin threads of readiness. What happens next does not require your participation. You don't need to decide. You don't need to drift. You don't need to sleep. Just stay where you are, in this quiet completion. Nothing is missing from it. Nothing needs to be added. And in this state, whether sleep comes or not, the body has already begun to recover, simply because, for the first time all day, it is no longer being asked to be anything more than what it already is. There is something that happens after tiredness has finished explaining itself. Not sleep, not relief, not resolution, just a thinning of edges, a thinning of intention, a thinning of the sense that anything needs to be held together. This is the stage most people never notice because it does not announce itself as an experience. It announces itself as less experience. Earlier in the night, tiredness was something you could feel, a weight, a heaviness, a reluctance. Now even that begins to soften, not disappear, diffuse, like fog no longer trying to be fog. At this point, the nervous system is no longer negotiating with you. It is no longer asking permission. It is no longer sending signals. It has already decided that awareness itself can be reduced. This is not sleep yet. This is pre-unawareness, a state where consciousness is still present but no longer prioritized. During the day, awareness is treated as essential. You must notice, you must monitor, you must stay oriented. At night, that contract expires. The system begins to behave as if awareness is optional. And when awareness becomes optional, energy demand drops to its lowest level. This drop does not feel dramatic. It feels like forgetting that you were paying attention. You may notice moments where you lose track of time, then gently return, not startled, not confused, just back. Those gaps are important. They are not distractions. They are micro-absences. The nervous system testing how little awareness it can maintain without consequence. Each successful gap builds confidence. Confidence reduces vigilance. Reduced vigilance allows longer gaps. This is how the system transitions without forcing. Force would require energy, so the system uses absence instead. Another subtle change happens here. At this stage, thoughts no longer feel like your thoughts. They arise, but without ownership. You don't follow them. You don't resist them. They pass like background noise in another room. This is not detachment. It is de-identification. Identity is expensive. At night, the system no longer funds it, so thoughts lose their owner. Without an owner, they lose urgency. Without urgency, they lose energy. Without energy, they fade. This is not something you do. It is something that happens when effort has fully withdrawn. Another layer appears in the body. Sensations become less defined. You may still feel warmth, pressure, breath, but they are no longer mapped precisely. The body is no longer being scanned. Scanning costs energy. At night, scanning stops. Without scanning, sensation blurs. Blur feels safe. Sharpness requires readiness. Blur does not. This is why nighttime awareness often feels wide but vague. Not focused, not empty, just unpointed. Unpointed awareness uses very little energy. It is one of the most restful waking states the nervous system can enter. Most people never stay here long enough to notice it. They fall asleep, or they re-engage. But this state exists regardless. It is the threshold. Another subtle phenomenon occurs. At this stage, the nervous system stops differentiating between inner and outer. Sounds fade into sensation. Thoughts fade into silence. Breath fades into rhythm. Boundaries soften, not disappear, just become irrelevant. Boundary maintenance costs energy. At night, irrelevance is preferred. This is why the sense of "I am here" begins to loosen, not frighteningly, gently, like loosening your grip without realizing you were gripping. This is the deepest form of tiredness, not exhaustion, not collapse, but permission to dissolve structure. Structure gave shape to the day. At night, shape is no longer required, only continuity. And continuity does not require sharpness. It requires rhythm, breath, heartbeat, temperature. These are automatic. They do not require attention. So attention fades. Another important aspect here, at this stage, the nervous system is no longer responding to meaning at all. Meaning has been fully suspended, not rejected, just set aside. Meaning belongs to daylight. Night belongs to process without interpretation. This is why even profound questions lose their emotional charge here. They may still exist, but they no longer matter. Not because they are unimportant, because nothing needs to be processed now. Processing has ended. Integration is underway. Integration does not need awareness. It prefers absence. So the system encourages absence, gently, without force, without command. Another layer emerges in time perception. Time no longer feels long or short. It barely feels present. Moments blend. There is no anticipation of the next moment. This is crucial. Anticipation is energy consuming. Without it, energy demand approaches zero. This is the state the nervous system has been guiding you toward all night. Not sleep, but effortless continuity. Sleep may happen from here, often does. But even if it doesn't, The system has already achieved something essential. It has reached a state where nothing is being maintained. No posture, no narrative, no readiness, no self-monitoring. Maintenance has stopped, and stopping maintenance is what allows recovery. Another subtle shift happens here. At this stage, even the desire to rest disappears. Desire itself is energy, so the system releases it. You are no longer trying to rest. You're simply not doing anything else. This is the paradox. True rest begins when rest is no longer the goal. Goals create tension. Tension costs energy. At night, goals dissolve. Rest emerges, not as a feeling, as an absence of demand. This is why this state is hard to describe. Language is built for differentiation. This state has very little differentiation. It is not blank. It is undemanding. Nothing presses, nothing pulls, nothing waits. And because nothing waits, the system no longer has to prepare. Preparation is expensive. Without preparation, energy stabilizes. This stability is fragile. It cannot coexist with effort or curiosity. So if curiosity returns, the system gently pulls back. Fatigue returns briefly, just enough to discourage re-engagement. Then it fades again. This oscillation is normal. The system is learning how little it needs to stay aware. Eventually, the gaps lengthen. Awareness slips. Sleep arrives, or something very close to it. But even if it doesn't, this state is not wasted. It is deeply restorative, because the nervous system is finally allowed to exist without being observed. Observation is energy. Absence is rest. So if you find yourself here now, not asleep, not fully awake, just quietly present without direction, there is nothing to do, nothing to understand, nothing to optimize. This is not a moment that needs to be used. It only needs to be left alone. If sleep comes, it will come. If it doesn't, this state will still pass, because no state needs to be held. That is the final release. Not holding, not watching, not waiting, just allowing the system to continue on its own into whatever comes next without needing you to follow.